to do this because I know how important this work is. So thank you. Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring. Ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise high as the listening skies. Let it resound loud as the rolling sea. Sing a song full of the faith that our dark past, come on, has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that our present has brought us, facing the rising sun of a new day, of a new day begun. Let us march on till victory is won.
Okay, so we are going to be joined by the mayor, but he's coming. So since he's coming, I'm going to offer some more comments today. And I want to welcome you all again. Again, I'm Nicole Porter, Senior Director of Advocacy at the Sentencing Project. Somebody's going to give me a sign when the mayor's coming, and we're gonna make it happen. Until then, so while Antonio and others are in the room, I do want to really thank our co-host at Stand Up America and Chicago Votes. I know Reggie Thetford is here somewhere. Reggie, please raise your hand. Thank you. Yeah. A lot of us are meeting each other for the first time after being on Zoom for years at this point. And so I want to really grateful to the Chicago Votes team. I think Chicago Votes is over here and another places around the room. Thank you all. And then I want to thank Antonio Gutierrez, the convening manager. Antonio was recommended by a national partner at the Detention Watch Network, and Antonio has been a fantastic organizer of this event. So thank you, Antonio, for all the work that you've been doing. So over the next 2.5 days, I'm going to be excited to connect with all of you as advocacy organizers, including many of the directly impacted activists, researchers, communications experts, and others in the room who have dedicated their careers to challenging mass incarceration's collateral impacts through undoing voting bans targeted to persons living with felony convictions inside and outside of prison. During this Black August, which started in California prisons in the 1970s by Black freedom fighters who wanted to honor the lives and deaths of Black political prisoners killed by the state, bring awareness to prison conditions, and to honor the radical tradition of Black resistance, the Sentencing Project is continuing to mark 2023 as the 50th year of mass incarceration and has called on partners and the nation to join us in acknowledging the collateral impact of mass incarceration. 2023 marks the 50th year since the US prison population began its unprecedented surge. Prison populations peaked in 2009 and began a modest decline in 2010 of roughly 2% annually, but we are far from seeing an end to mass incarceration. At the current rate, it will take 75 years to arrive at pre-mass incarceration levels. So we cannot mark the 50th year of mass incarceration without acknowledging the continued and pervasive injustices that continue to impact Black communities in this country, from Jim Crow to disenfranchisement to mass incarceration. Black Americans, among other people of color, have shouldered a disproportionate burden of inequity as evidenced by the 1 in 19 who were disenfranchised from voting in 2022. The impact of BIPOC communities and other marginalized groups includes the 1 in 59 Latinx residents who are disenfranchised as of 2022, and the 1 million women banned from voting due to a felony conviction. Those who are here in this room and who are joining us virtually advance the democracy movement forward each day with ongoing efforts to challenge felony disenfranchisement and mass incarceration with a commitment and moral certainty, and usually without headlines or awards. But we see you. During 2023, there have been voting expansions with rights restoration victories in New Mexico and Minnesota. We're lucky to have Justin Allen here, who will be speaking to the tactics and political dynamics that led to this year's win in New Mexico. And Chris Eugen, who unfortunately could not make it here because he contracted COVID, but will now join us virtually, along with other researchers from Minnesota, Maryland, and Texas, who can speak to the recent impact of rights restoration expansions. Legislative advocacy isn't the only tactic to expand the vote. There was an encouraging federal ruling out of Mississippi earlier this month that could expand voting rights to 30,000 Mississippians with felony convictions if it withstands state appeals and pending cases in Virginia and Florida. Legal partners in Campaign Legal Center and SPLC are here who can offer their expertise as we strategize over the next few days. And there are challenges to counter too. Recent policy rollbacks in Virginia and Tennessee deepen disenfranchisement policies, strategies to counter politically hostile environments in Texas and Alabama call not on just state policy, state strategies, but also national ones that can help create the conditions that can make it possible for change in states that are currently not politically receptive to reform. And behind the millions of lost voters was James Jetter with Connecticut's Full Citizens Coalition, who's also here, who led a campaign in 2021 to expand the vote to all persons on parole, including himself. The more than 4.6 million disenfranchised today includes Karima Hanifa from Georgia's Inner City Muslim Action Network, who is working to expand the franchise in a state at the center of the nation's pro-democracy efforts, despite still being disenfranchised herself. There are others in this room, including Dee Dee Gatson over there from Nebraska. I know May from Arizona here, who are disenfranchised, and yet they are advancing democracy. They are participating in civic engagement as activists, as reformers, as democracy defenders. Pro-democracy efforts are happening across the Americas in an effort to stop fascist and counter-authoritarianism by supporting an inclusive democracy infrastructure that centers the voices of the marginalized and unheard. Those efforts unite pro-democracy advocates in an effort to understand that practices that guarantee ballot access for persons eligible to vote with qualifying incarceration statuses in local jails or state or federal prisons and bridges initiatives across borders. As I've already mentioned, we're joined by Antonella and Rodrigo from Chile over here. These activists are working to understand what is needed to free the vote, or voto preso, for those who are eligible to seize the opportunity to build on pro-democracy norms. And similar conversations are happening in Mexico and Bolivia and across the Atlantic in the United Kingdom and France. So we hope to build on similar efforts right here in the States over the next few days at Civic Power 2023. Ella Baker once said that this may only be a dream of mine, but it can be made real. So Baker's comments hopefully can ground us over the next 2 days and let a collective dream inspire us to fight to expand the franchise and guarantee the ballot. So your dreams and perspectives, your strategies and expertise are critical, not only within the movement to challenge 50 years of mass incarceration, but within the broader struggle for inclusive democracy. So I'm gonna wrap up. Do we have a time check on the mayor? All right, well, here we go. So as I start to wrap up my comments and as the mayor starts to make his way into the room, I'm gonna ask us all to commit and join each other over the next few days through the spirit of collaboration, connection, to be inspired by ideas that can help power and drive next steps. We're going to have content today and tomorrow, and hopefully many of you are staying through Sunday, where we can talk together, strategize, and leave Chicago, leave this convening with some ideas that can help ground us through the end of the year and through the next. So thank you all for being here. I want to say happy Black August and welcome to Civic Power 2023. So as we await the mayor, is Stevie Ballas here? Valle came in to greet with the mayor, yes. Okay, yeah. Here you are, come on, Stevie. Are you gonna wait and escort the mayor out? Okay, that's fine. What else can we say? Meet your neighbor. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I hope everybody is able to connect over the next few days. I know people came together. Many people came from Georgia. Many people may know each other from previous work, but a lot of us are meeting each other for the first time in person. So hopefully people will really get an opportunity to establish connections, and it can help create cross-state collaboration, national collaboration, and can really help inspire the work going forward when we leave here. Oh, great announcement, great opportunity for announcement here. Chicago is a fantastic city. We did not arrive on the best day, given that there was literally a heat dome, and many of us have been commenting on the oppressive heat that we landed into. And for those of you from Chicago, I feel sorry. I hope everybody has central air, everybody. But I hear that the weather is getting better. I think today, I walked out earlier, it was a little bit better. You know, we're in downtown Chicago. There's a lot of landmarks and great places to go see when we have downtime during the convening. So we hope everybody gets to go to the beach. It's essentially an urban beach right here in Chicago, if you haven't been able to walk there yet or visit it yet. And the lake is not too far from this wonderful hotel. So there's great landmarks that are in short walking distance. So, you know, we planned a lot of content today and tomorrow. It's going to be a long day, but dinner's on our own. And hopefully during downtime, you all can take in the sights of the Windy City and enjoy Chicago. Go to the lake, go to the river. There's a rooftop. Yeah. 3 minutes is a long time. What else can I say? How did the press conference go? Great, yeah. All right. So I'm going to just say my name again, Nicole Porter, Senior Director of Advocacy at the Sentencing Project. And now I have the honor of welcoming Mayor Brandon Johnson to the stage. So Mayor Johnson is an American educator, elected as the 57th mayor of Chicago earlier this year, and he previously served on the Cook County Board of Commissioners from 2018 to 2023, representing the 1st District, and is a dedicated justice reformer. So please join me in welcoming the mayor to Civic Power.
Thank you so much, and good morning. And I do appreciate the applause. This is much how my day would begin when I taught middle school in Chicago. Just Black children would just clap for me every time I walked into the classroom. So thank you for that fond memory. So I'm so grateful to be with you all on this morning. And on behalf of the entire city, I'd like to welcome you all to the greatest freaking city in the world, the city of Chicago. I know, I see, I lost half of you right there. It's okay. I know y'all looking for property in Chicago, I know. But thank you all, you know, to the Sentencing Project, Chicago Votes, and Stand Up America for your work and your dedication to move us closer towards liberation. We are gathered here today for an important conference, as you all know, for an issue and over an issue that has touched the lives of so many people, but quite frankly, It touches the very foundation of our American democratic structure and system here. Now, as been articulated already, before I became mayor of the city of Chicago, I served as a middle school public school teacher. Now, teaching middle school has tremendous advantages. Mostly, no matter what I do, I get to go to heaven for free. I am confident that the Lord will say, "Well done, thy good and faithful servant." But teaching middle school, if you would just indulge me for a second and try not to nod off, I'm just saying, don't act like y'all always enjoyed going to social studies. But it is in that experience that really gave me the motivation to become the person that I am today. And even though it's been some time since I've been in the classroom, it taught me so much. So let's talk a little bit about history. As some of you all know, in 1861, there was a profound struggle just outside Washington, D.C. It was called the Battle of Bull Run. And this battle, in which almost 3,000 Union soldiers died, marked the beginning of a formative war in this nation's history. It was a battle, some say, between the North and the South, but in reality, it was a battle between freedom against slavery. And in this first battle, we know that slavery prevailed. So the Union had to regroup, retool, build its armies, and train soldiers. Many more battles were fought over the next 4 years until the side of freedom decided to take a definitive stance and actually allow Black soldiers to participate in this epic struggle. Now, many of you all have studied and know the great abolitionist Frederick Douglass, who made the case when he said, "Who would be free for themselves must strike the first blow." And just like that, almost 200,000 Black soldiers enlisted to strike the blow. But it was not only the soldiers that struck the blow that brought down this mighty system of oppression called slavery. It was also enslaved people themselves in what W.E.B. Du Bois called a general strike, where hundreds of thousands and then millions of enslaved people walked off the plantation and crippled the Southern system. They cast their votes for freedom with their feet, walking hundreds of miles to Union lines and dealing the death blow to the cause of slavery. April 9th, you won't have a quiz on this, don't panic, okay? 1865, where freedom had been declared over slavery. Now, as awesome as this victory comes across in the pages in our history books across this country, this would not be a country that would be ultimately satisfied with that decision. And it was awesome. But this would not be an oligarchy of white supremacy, but we still weren't satisfied. This would ultimately become a multiracial democracy, something that the world had not experienced of like. But the world would come to understand that the people of this democracy would still not be satisfied. And as you know, that the 15th Amendment that was ratified by Congress, given this power to ultimately build a democracy, we know that as emphatic as that language is, it has not provided the full satisfaction and the realization of who we are as a nation. But here's what it says: the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied by the United States or by any state on the account of race, color, or previous conditions of servitude. Shall not be denied. Now, could it be any clearer? Has there ever been a constitutional amendment that straightforward in our nation's history? So how is it that we find ourselves over 150 years later organizing still for the right to vote? How is it that we are still engaged in the struggle between freedom and slavery over a century and a half after hundreds of thousands of Americans sacrificed their lives for freedom? How is it that in the year 2023, we find ourselves with more people locked up in chains than in the year 1823? How is it that incarceration people, those who are incarcerated, still are being forced to work for pennies on the dollar, a country that is still not satisfied? And so for that answer to that difficult question, he must again look to Du Bois as he studied Black Reconstruction in America, that slavery went free, stood a brief moment in the sun, then moved back again towards slavery. Because they imposed poll taxes, literacy tests, the Black codes, Jim Crow laws, the Ku Klux Klan terrorism. You have people right now in this country that still refuse to accept the results of the civil rights as well as the Civil War. There are people who want a rematch on the Civil War. Though their tools may have changed, instead of lynch mobs, they use voter suppression, gerrymandering, fear-mongering, state legislators, right-wing governors, but their goal is still the same. Martin Luther King made it very clear. Until we possess the right to vote, I do not possess myself. In a word, slavery. He struggled with millions of others, Black, white, Latino, Native Americans, and Asian Americans, unified in a mass movement to force our government to pass the Voting Rights Act of 1965, of which they thought that would be the bill that will solve it all. Over 1 million in the state of Florida alone had their rights to vote stripped from them. And unfortunately, we still find ourselves in a position where we do indeed need another voting bill. But isn't that why we're here this morning? We need to build off the work of Frederick Douglass, those who sacrificed their lives, W.E.B. Du Bois, Martin Luther King Jr. We need a voting rights bill that will force the 15th Amendment without exception. That's what we need, and that's what we're going to do, and that's what we're going to build. So today, we say, give us the ballot, and we will transform this nation. We will fulfill the promise of our own Constitution. We will guarantee to every single American the right to participate in this democracy. And what do we get as a right to participate in this democracy? It gives us the ability to commit to building affordable housing, public housing, a pathway to home ownership. It gives us the ability to embrace the labor movement. As Dr. King said, the labor rights movement and the civil rights movement, if it were to ever collide, what enormous potential it will have. Well, that potential is manifesting today in the brilliance of the minds and the struggle that is in this room. We are also fighting for the right to the ballot to make sure that we have good paying jobs and making human right healthcare so that no matter who you are, where you are, you get to access quality healthcare. That's what this movement is about. Democracy means rule by the people, not rule by some people. The right to vote is not a privilege to vote. It's a right to vote. And that's what we are fighting for today. And so I'm honored to be with you all today at this conference, because we are filled with so much joy and aspiration to be in a room with freedom fighters, with soldiers, individuals who understand the makeup of who we are as a nation, and that we cannot fulfill the greatness of this nation until every single person has the ability to vote. Not in 100 years, not 50 years from now, but I'm talking about today. The freedom for triumph begins with those of you who are in this room today. And so with that struggle, know that you have a brother on the 5th floor who fully supports the complete liberation of our people. Thank you all, and God bless you.
Thank you, Mayor. Appreciate you. So I don't know exactly how this is going to work because we're going to transition into our plenary. Chris Ugan is going to join us virtually from Minnesota. All right. So this is our opening plenary movement update to guarantee voting rights. We wanted to start the session off after the mayor's remarks with sort of a conversation between activists and academics. So hopefully Chris can join us, who's the lead researcher on much of the efforts documenting impact of people disenfranchised and has been doing that work since the early 2000s. But we're also joined by fantastic activists here in Illinois. So Marlon, to my left, is an advocate for directly impacted by the justice system. Marlon brings over 20 years of lived and professional experience to his work as the executive director of the Illinois Coalition to End Permanent Punishments. Thank you for being here, Marlon. And then Stevie Valle. Did I say your name right? Yeah. Valles. I keep butchering your name. I apologize, Stevie. All right. As long as you know my intentions are good. Stevie really needs no introduction, but is the co-executive director of our co-host Chicago Votes, a nonpartisan nonprofit organization building a more inclusive democracy by building power in the hands of young Chicagoans. So longer bios are in the app. So I want to encourage everybody to use the app to read up on our speakers as we go through the day. Chris, when he joins us, if he is able to join us virtually, has some new dates.
I'm here, Nicole. So I just need to turn on if I can start my video, etc. It'll work just fine.
Fantasy, that voice coming into the room.
Oh, sorry.
However many miles away Minneapolis is. So as Chris starts is able to share his screen and join us, he'll share some research and updated information on rights restoration. But I want to start off a question with Marlon and Stevie. Given the gathering that we're starting today, what do you all view as an opportunity for having national partners from states, transnational partners traveling in from Latin America? What do you all view as an opportunity to have this conversation here in Chicago?
So good morning, everyone. First, love the energy. I would say that I think one of the opportunities that we have during this weekend is to hear like what's working across the country, across the world, what's not working. What are some strategies that have worked in different places in terms of introducing legislation, or how have you been able to sort of navigate the legislator or even just the narrative around like what we want to do? I recently had an opportunity to travel to Israel for 8 days for a leadership retreat. And one of the things that we learned in Israel was that in prison, they can still vote. They don't lose their voting rights when they're incarcerated, and they also have access to higher education. And so I think this is yet another opportunity for us to hear from people across the country or the world around like how is it working? Like what are some of the challenges that we see, and also to develop and build relationships, because I'm a true believer that as you continue to build out your network, like those are relationships that you can continue to learn and keep in contact with to continue to grow. And have thought partners, and I would also say sometimes you need people just to call and vent, because this work can be frustrating, it can be challenging, and just being able to reach out to people across the world, even if it's for just a few minutes before you level set and begin to really think about like, what do I need to do next to move forward in this work? Like, this is just a good space. Like it's good energy and a good place to learn.
Hey, everyone. I'm Stevie. Welcome to Chicago. I am really excited to have this space with all of you who are leading in different parts of the long spectrum that is rights restoration across the country and across the world. I think over the course of this weekend, one of the things I'm most excited about, and one of the things that I think we can all greatly benefit from, is just understanding how unified our struggle is state by state, and getting a full understanding of the full spectrum of what we mean by rights restoration. Here in Chicago and in Illinois, I think of this as an opportunity state. We have the opportunity right now, with a supermajority of Democrats in our House and our Senate, a governor who supports restoring the right to vote to people who are in prison. You just heard from our mayor. We have the opportunity to give the right back to people who are currently in prison, and we'll be the first state to restore that right back to people who are in prison. Vermont and Maine allow people to vote while they're in prison, but Vermont and Maine don't adequately represent the prison industrial complex and the communities that the prison industrial complex impacts, which is Black people, brown people, poor folks. There's about 35,000 people who could get their right to vote in Illinois if we're able to pass this law. Just as important as this opportunity is, we have states where once you get a felony once, you're done for, you know? And that's concerning, especially in the United States, when we lock up 25% of the world's population. This is a systemic thing that's built to silence the voices of Black folks, of brown folks, of poor folks in our democracy. And as a result, we're seeing how our communities look. We're seeing how problematic the prison conditions are. And so I think over this weekend, we can build a united front around this very important issue as we're heading into a presidential election, to push it to the front of the agenda for whoever the candidates are running for office, because we're talking about millions of people over the course of history who have not had a voice in our democracy. And as a result of that, our democracy is not working for us. So I'm excited to be in community with y'all. I'm excited to have a national community around this issue. And I'm excited for the ideas and the momentum we can carry on after this weekend to try to push back against these white supremacist policies that have been on our necks for so long.
So Chris, welcome.
Hello.
Can you share with us what developments there are on rights restoration nationally, particularly with the new information and the new research that you have to share?
Yes, I'd be glad to. I perhaps if I'm not able to share my video or screen, I think it says the host has to allow that, but if not, I can read that and we can advance the slides kind of manually.
What did he say? He said they're working on it, Chris.
Oh, okay, great. Oh, look at that. Awesome. Yes, so the let's move to the next slide, please. That's me. Next slide, please. I am so happy to be with you today. I know that the real work and the real change makers are in the room, the advocates and the directly impacted folks who've brought great change in the area of Restore the Vote. Over 1.5 million people have regained the vote since 2016, and about 10 states. And it's been kind of piecemeal reform around the country, but there has been a pattern to it, and I think it points to the way ahead. So next slide, please. The mayor was quite eloquent in describing what was happening in the 19th century and disenfranchising measures. This chart here in the red line shows the how the timing and when the laws that disenfranchised people convicted of crimes were passed. And it was in the 1860s and 1870s. along with the poll taxes and grandfather clauses and all of the other things that emerged out of the Civil War and Reconstruction eras. But they've still kind of bumped along even to the present day, that states are still trying to suppress the vote. Next slide, please. Now we're looking at restore the vote. This is the yellow dotted line here. And there was a big increase, if you follow along on the bottom there, in the 1960s and 1970s civil rights movement. But look at that line go up in 2010, 2020 to 2023. There has been a ton through all of your work. There's been a ton of tremendous activity and action on this issue. And I think this is still a story that is untold. Again, there's much to do, but you all have had some terrific success, and I take my hat off to the Sentencing Project and many others out there making this change happen. Next page, please. If we sort this into different buckets, we can kind of get a better sense for where the action has been. And I would say, we mentioned Maine and Vermont, which again are not indicative of the overall practice, but that is where there's no restrictions and people can vote while currently incarcerated. Then we have a number of states that are disenfranchised people who are currently incarcerated. And Illinois and Michigan are among them and have been for a long time. Then we have states that disenfranchise people on paper in the community, on probation, serving parole sentences. And finally, we have those states that disenfranchise post-sentence, like after one is completely off paper. Now, the action is in those states shaded in yellow there, moving from states that have disenfranchised people on probation and parole to states that disenfranchise prison only. So next slide, please. I've got a list where some of the action has been. As Nicole mentioned, we have Minnesota and New Mexico. My home state of Minnesota is among them. As well as Connecticut, New York. You can go right down the line. I won't move through that in the interest of time. So if possible, could we move to the next slide, please? Now, these charts, and I apologize for the charts and graphs. My students complain about too many of these, but I want to tell the story as quickly and efficiently as I can. What you're looking at is a graph of progress in restoring the vote, and incomplete progress over the last century. So we've had major changes to restoring the vote to people post-sentence, and these occurred, as I mentioned, in the civil rights era largely, and we're still making some progress, often through governor's offices and executive orders, et cetera. But it's only 78% of states that allow people to vote post-sentence, even when they're off paper. So there's still work to do there. Now, next slide, please, will show probation and parole. Here is where we've had that action I talked about, the 10 states with recent changes. That is, so now we're up to about 50% of states one can vote while one is currently on paper and in the community. Then next slide, please. Here is where we've stalled. This is prison. So prison, we've remained under 10%, and now we're about 4% with just those 2 out of 50 states in which people who are currently incarcerated can vote. So I have a story of both success and then stalled progress here. And I know that that we'll be talking in the next couple of days about all of the activities around the U.S. to re-enfranchise folks inside. So this is the non-expansion for people in prison, and we even lost states like Massachusetts and Utah in the past half century. So next slide, please. That adds it all up, and you can see kind of the whole pie. Let's move to the next slide. Now, I can tell you, I've been doing some work on what has predicted passage of Restore the Vote legislation in the last few years. And I know this is a nonpartisan gathering, and we're not talking about party politics, but it has been the case that states with Democratic governors and Democratic legislators have been more likely to pass such laws in the past few years. That wasn't the case 50 years ago. That wasn't the case 100 years ago, but that has been the case in the last few years. Then place still matters quite a bit. And particularly in the South, it has been very difficult to change these laws. We've seen states throughout the rest of the we've seen changes throughout the rest of the United States, not just the Northeast, but the Midwest and the West as well. Punishment is also correlated with passage of the law, and that is that states that have lower incarceration rates have been the ones most likely to restore the vote. As well, policy pressure seems to matter. It's been tougher to get these changes passed when the homicide rate is high, when crime is up. It's been a little bit easier to get them passed when the labor demand is there, when we have high unemployment and people value the labor of returning citizens. I'd say there's also an association with the percentage of the state population that is white has been a positive predictor in recent years, although not nearly as big a predictor as it was of disenfranchisement in the 19th century. Now, the big piece of this that really matters, apart from these numbers, has been the advocacy and the work on the ground and all of the organizing and disseminating information. And I can't stress that enough. That to me, that's been the big change in the last 5 or 10 years, has been the continued efforts and what I'd consider the body blows that the community advocates have made on this issue. Next slide, please. Let me just give a sneak peek at some of the work we've got coming. We'll be doing another report in 2024. We are working on state-specific gender estimates. We'll be able to give you, folks have been asking for that for a few years, and Ryan Larson and Molly Hoff have been working on that this summer. I can tell you that in 5% of the in 5 states, there's over 5% of the female population is ineligible to vote, and that is Alabama, Kentucky, Mississippi, Tennessee, and Wyoming. These are kind of the usual suspects where they disenfranchise post-sentence for high rates of disenfranchisement. We're also continuing work on the passage of these Restore the Vote laws and looking at unlawful voting prosecutions, which to me is a real shame of the nation and efforts at targeted voting suppression. And finally, considering estimates for American Indian populations and other groups as well. As I said, I want to leave you with this notion of hope that many states are changing their laws, and we're chipping away. 1.5 million people have regained the vote. But also with the charge and the call that we need to really redouble our efforts to restore the vote for people inside currently. I'll stop there. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Chris. We wish you a speedy recovery, and disappointed that you can't be here with us in person. But do thank you for your comments and the research that you're sharing, that you shared today. And don't go anywhere. We have some more questions for you before we wrap up this panel.
Excellent.
So, Marlon, I want to come back to you. Given the overview that Chris just provided, and I would say 2 trends in reform. There's successful efforts around expanding the vote to people in the community after incarceration. Recent wins this year in New Mexico and Minnesota, but the stalled progress for expanding the vote to people inside of prison. Given your work here, leading campaigns, leading movements in Illinois, what do you think is needed to help sort of connect these two trends in terms of the rights restoration and help sort of push the conversation forward in guaranteeing the ballot for those in prison?
Great question. Um, First and foremost, I would say there needs to be more investments in campaigns or initiatives that are led by formerly incarcerated people. And when specifically, I think like, and I'll use myself as an example. In 2002, I was sentenced to a 20-year federal prison sentence. And in 2010, and this was sort of a wake-up call for me in terms of prior to my incarceration, I was one of those individuals that I was not voting. Don't talk to me about politics. It doesn't work. I don't see the impact. How does it influence my community, or how is it going to help me? And in 2010, a federal piece of legislation passed called the Fair Sentencing Act, which changed the ratio between crack and cocaine. And the only difference between the two is baking soda. That's a completely different story. But as a result of this, like I started to think about like, wow, this stuff works. Like what can I do coming out the system to get involved? And so coming out the system, I was motivated to get involved because of I saw how a policy change impact me. But what I would say, and this is where the investment needs to be made, there are marginalized communities all across the state of Illinois and this country where people only show up during election times. And we knock on doors and we beg people to go vote, but then afterwards, people don't see those individuals again until 3 or 4 years later. And so what I think needs to be done is that there has to be an approach where even during non-election cycles, we're knocking on doors and we're talking to people with the goal of building that relationship and also doing inventory. As we're talking to people, we can also mention resources and things that are available to help their immediate needs with the long-term goal of engaging them in this work. And that's an investment because a lot of us can't afford to go and send canvases out year round, but that's something that needs to be done. And once we have a list of individuals, whether they're formerly incarcerated or just individuals who don't participate in the process, then phase 2, we can begin to really sort of try to engage them around like why this work is important and really encourage them to get involved. So to me, there has to be and this is sort of like just thinking outside the box. Like there has to be strategies that we know work for our communities in terms of educating them on the importance of this process and being honest. Like our system of democracy is not perfect and we have to be honest about that. But we also have to be able to show people that when we engage ourselves in the process, we can help improve it and strengthen it and also amplify our voices in terms of what we need in our communities.
Yeah, I mean, I think going through that data, a few things stuck out to me. All the states where over 5% of women can't vote because of incarceration, all restrict reproductive rights. So like no shit. The other thing that stuck out to me is, states with Democratic majorities tend to do things that are more helpful. But let me tell you, that's not guaranteed. I mentioned earlier, we have super majorities. We've ended cash bail. We turned our jail into a polling location. But when it comes to this voting in prison issue, everybody's like, we're for it, we support it, but there's always some bureaucratic something that stops it from getting called to the floor, that we got it voted out of committee once, but the committee chairperson was like, we'll vote it out of committee, but y'all got to promise not to call it on the floor. And it's just like, well, what are we doing here, we need, as Marlon said, we need more directly impacted folks, not only leading these campaigns, but serving in public office. We need more directly impacted folks, not only leading these campaigns and serving in public offices, running the administrative work in our in our governments as well, because the implementation element of it is just as vital. A population that wasn't mentioned in the data is those folks who are on pretrial detention.
Mhm.
I'm gonna put y'all on to a little secret and make sure y'all don't tell too many people. Everybody in the United States of America on pretrial detention is an eligible voter, and the Supreme Court ruled that. I say keep it a secret because we don't want to let the Supreme Court know now. They're gonna shut that shit down immediately. So, you know, when you get back in your communities, just know that there is something there. And that's where we started our campaign here in Illinois and Chicago. We started registering people to vote who were on pretrial detention. And through that registration, we asked if we could bring a polling location in here so folks can actually cast their ballot. We advocated, we turned our jail into a polling location. So now people in jail here in Chicago have the opportunity to vote in the jail. And that voter turnout went from less than 8% when they were forced to have to vote by mail to over 40%. Yeah. And that's real power, you know, without people in jail having the right to vote, there's no Brandon Johnson. And there's stuff like that you could do in your states. If you have vote by mail in your state, figure out a way to talk to your folks on the inside so they know that they can request a ballot. Many states that are super red, shout out to Texas, I used to live there. Houston, Dallas, Fort Worth, Austin, San Antonio, not red. These are blue cities. County officials are blue. Sheriffs are pretty blue. Holler at them. They can make that happen without state legislation. And so in addition to knocking on doors between election time, empowering directly impacted people to lead our work, bringing directly impacted people into the work, helping to draw that correlation between, you know, participating in democracy and their lived experience. There's also a ton of avenues within this bureaucratic democracy that we operate in that will allow for us to make progress and take the power out of the hands of the politicians while we try to get better politicians elected. So.
Thank you. So I definitely think some of the trends that have helped drive change with and expand voting rights to people living with felonies has been documenting the impact. The Sentencing Project first published numbers in the late 90s, and then Chris Eugen and other researchers started following up in the early 2000s, and Chris gave some of the latest overview today. So, but in addition to that research, it's taking the information, applying it, and helping to inform what's happening in real conversations on the ground. So I'm curious to Chris, and then I'll come to you, Marlon and Stevie. What do you see as opportunities between partnerships with academics and researchers and the movement, not just in terms of answering new research questions, but also applying that research for policy discussions and for other movement strategies?
Yes, Nicole, this is a really important question, and I don't think we fully appreciated how important it is to have organizations like the Sentencing Project, and there are others as well that are connectors that link the research to the advocates and community members and directly impacted folks. This is a what you're able to do, honestly, is put us in touch in a way that we can't do it ourselves. I know Katie Remington, who's in the crowd there. I see her in Minneapolis, but I don't see everybody else day to day. I am, and what you do with your webinars and by distributing the materials, and I'll just say this, a lot of my research is locked behind paywalls in journals. And the Sentencing Project and the Brennan Center and others I could name really freely distribute information and make sure folks are up to date. and you schedule webinars. And so I'm not just saying this to kind of kiss up to the organizers or anything, but I think that's what we need, is we need these connections so that when folks have questions and folks want to really use the research, that they can. Otherwise, I think the research, I don't want to say it's empty, because it's what I build my life around, but I do think that it doesn't have the power that it could. Now, I also think that what researchers need to know is what you all are hearing on the ground about which messages resonate. Like, I do a lot of work on international comparisons, but I know that when I go testify in the state legislature, they don't want to hear what they're doing in France. They want to hear about their state, and they want to hear about their district, and they want numbers that are up to date, rather than necessarily global comparisons or something. And in some cases, some of the themes that have mattered quite a bit are racial justice. And I think that's part of what has happened since 2020, that the George Floyd murder has moved some of that forward. In other states, they want to hear about reintegration and about the importance of voting for strengthening families, for strengthening communities. And so you all know the message that best fits your state and your opportunities. But so we as researchers will kind of be taking some marching orders from you. So I've got a lot more to say on that, but I so appreciate the opportunity to share.
Marlon, Stevie, do you have questions for Chris or suggestions for Chris in terms of how organizers and advocates can use research, or what the needs might be for movements in Chicago and Illinois and across the country?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the relationship is crucial. Like, we cannot do this alone. Like, the more people that are involved in this work and can provide data and research, because it's funny when you talk to a legislator, when they're like, no, 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 and you ask them for like any data points that support their position, they rarely have any. And I think the more data points that we can provide in terms of, I believe that voting in prison is a rehabilitation tool, because it starts to connect people to community in a way where people start to see how their voices matter. And I think the more we can lift that up in data and showing that people that are connected, that are participating civically, they're involved, and we can show what the rates are in terms of people who go back and reoffend, like, those are data points that you can't argue. So I think the more we can collaborate in terms of like just tracking people's involvement in the work, civic participation, like, these are data points that we can continue to lift up, and even just educating our communities on the importance of why people should be able to vote while they're in prison. Like, that's how you stay connected. That's how you advocate for your family even while you're away. So I think just using the data to educate our communities, but also using those data points to inform legislators and to respond to the fear mongering that they create in terms of like how they talk about individuals in prison. Like, my experience in prison was not the TV version of what you see on TV. Like, those were some of the most respected men that I've ever met in my life. And I wouldn't be who I am today if it wasn't for the investment that men made into me while I was in prison. And those are the stories that are not always told. So people are hungry to learn. And this is a moment where people have time and people process information. Like, we wouldn't just vote for an individual just because he's a Democrat. Like, people actually do the research and have intelligent debates about what's happening politically. So if you give people that opportunity to connect to community and see how their voices like still matter, people will engage in the process. And I think it's important that we work with researchers to provide that data and continue to lift up and tell the story, a different story than what we see on the news or what we hear from some of our politicians.
I agree. I think another effective tool or tactic that we could utilize through research and data is showing how many people support this. Most people support this. I'm convinced. I could be delusional. I mean, it depends on what side of the like the mayor is saying, some folks want a rematch. It depends on what side of the rematch of that Civil War you're on. But I argue that most people support this. When you really get down to brass tacks and you start talking to people about the logic of disenfranchisement, there is none. And being able to utilize data and research to show community support would be extremely helpful in Illinois. We're going into 2024, I forget what year it is, 2024. It's not only a presidential election, it's we have a lot of state legislators on the ballot. And what we're hearing from the Speaker of the House, who's a supporter of this bill, is that he's nervous to call our bill to the floor because he doesn't want to put those seats in jeopardy. He doesn't want to make those Democrats who are up for re-election take a hard vote on something and lose. But our hypothesis is that the people in their districts will vote them back in if they vote for this. We already passed something way more radical than this in Illinois. And when the midterm elections came, we gained seats. Not we, the Democrats gained seats. Not very, we're nonpartisan. I'm also not a Democrat, so and that just so we're clear. I'm liberated. No, but the Democrats gained seats when they voted for something more radical. And so what we're finding is people will bend themselves into all kind of pretzels and knots to try to come up with some political philosophy or tactic to tell you why they can't do the thing that needs to be done. And so that data and research to push back on that is highly effective, especially when you're directly impacted led, because these politicians don't take you serious, especially when you're young, because these politicians don't take you serious. So having that academic backing to prove what we already know is super helpful.
Thank you. So this is my last question. Then we're gonna come out to all of you all and with any questions or comments that you have before we wrap up and move on with the agenda. So we have won. We won in Minnesota and New Mexico this year. We've won previously in Nevada, Connecticut. The win is one thing. Supporting a voting culture is another in terms of implementation, in terms of when the win is won, guaranteeing access to the ballot, getting people registered, and engaging people in the vote. So Marlon, you spoke to the political education. I too have been moved and changed by political education discussions I've had with folks inside. How can the winning, how can the campaigns, how can the movement conversations you all are leading here in Chicago and the folks in the room are leading across the country contribute to that voting culture so that when the win happens, not just in those remaining states where post-incarceration wins have to happen, post-sentence wins have to happen. And as we move the conversation to folks inside and expanding the franchise to people inside, how can that support a voting culture so that people participate in the franchise when they have the vote?
So, great question. So what I was saying, what we're hoping to build here in Illinois, just as an example, like I think what I've seen in this work over the last 11 years that I've been involved in this work is that a lot of our work is driven by issues, meaning depending on the organization you work for, that's the issue you work on, and that's it. But what I haven't seen is this long-term investment in a power structure that lives beyond myself and many of us that are doing this work. And the reason why this is important is, yes, we do a lot of advocating and we go down to the Capitol and we do all of this work. But the sad reality is in maybe 5 or 10 years, the work that we're doing today can be rolled back with the strike of a pen. And so what we need to do and what we're attempting to do is set up chapters and regional tables that become hubs where we have individuals that can train and do workshops and teach people on the importance of not just like rights restoration, but also the implementation phases of making sure and holding folks accountable, making sure that when we pass something that is implemented properly in the ways that it's supposed to, but also doing outreach to people to bring awareness on what we've done and the importance of what we've done. And so I think it's a long-term approach of one, just establishing these spaces where people can have these conversations. And then I would also encourage a lot of our reentry organizations or just direct service related organizations, like those could be like touch points where people can educate people on the importance of voting or making sure that you're registered to vote. So I think it's definitely going to take a community effort. But I also think it starts with just creating those spaces where people can have real conversations and we can encourage individuals, but then also identifying people who want to focus strictly on implementation, who want to do outreach to educate people on the importance of registering to vote and voting. But then also you need that collective movement to hold folks accountable and to protect the wins that we create over the next couple of years, because what we've seen throughout history is that a win today could be a loss tomorrow. So we have to have that long-term power structure that does the work of the day-to-day grind of getting people involved and educating people.
So I think coalition building is really important. Coalition building on the front end, you know, whether it's drafting a piece of legislation. I have to give a shout out to Ami Gandhi over there. You can put your hand in the air, Ami. Ami and Cliff. Is Cliff in here still? Where's Cliff at? He's on Zoom. All right. They're with the Chicago Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. And ever since we even thought about registering voters in the jail, which kind of got this program started, they've been with us every single step of the way. And because they've been with us every single step of the way, we knew when we were registering voters that we needed to protect them. When we wanted to bring a polling location into the jail, they came with us to advocate to the Chicago Board of Elections and the clerk's office. When we drafted that legislation, they made sure the language was proper, because when it came time to implementation, there was going to be implementation problems. And we are still working together to implement that legislation day in and day out. We also passed a law that requires people in prison to be given civic education courses as part of their reentry process, peer-led civic education courses. And shout out to Alex Boutros from our team at Chicago Votes. How many peer educators have we trained in the prisons in Illinois? Over 200. Over 200. So we've trained over 200 people who are currently incarcerated to teach civic education to people who are being released from prison. And so that's kind of like the systemic things you can do to try to build that like voting and civic culture, and like make sure that you're still involved with the implementation. I mean, we passed that law, but Alex and our team is still training these peer educators. Alex and our professor colleague, who I'm not sure, she's going to be on Zoom with a group from prison, actually, to hopefully she'll be calling in from prison. So we'll have people on the inside able to join the conference. They're still updating that curriculum. We're running programs around court watching. So we're taking people into these courtrooms to watch these judicial proceedings, to gather data on gender and racial bias. And we're using that data to create voter guides to distribute to people so they know who they're voting for when they're voting for judges. you know, we're getting really into the nitty gritty of what the issues actually are. Because like Marlon said, people who are locked up, people who have been locked up. I was raised by folks who have been locked up. Like I do work in prisons and jails. These are the smartest, wisest, most intellectual, grounded individuals you will ever meet. Trying to tell them you should vote for a Democrat is crazy. But telling them that we're about to go watch these judges and we're going to gather data on these judges and we're going to distribute this data to everybody so everybody knows how racist and homophobic and xenophobic and problematic these judges are, so we could vote them out of office, and then we're going to train abolitionist lawyers and try to get them to run. Then, yeah, right? Shout out to Avalon. Shout out to Avalon, coalition partner. What I just said is her idea. So yeah, you know, we're really trying to build something real that ain't just on the surface to walk around with victories. We're trying to build sustainable systemic power that bakes into a culture of civic participation and voting, not only for directly impacted people, people who are currently incarcerated, and the millions and millions and millions of people who are impacted by their experience and their communities. So
Yeah.
Oh, there's Chris. I didn't know
Yeah.
that he come off.
Hey,
Did you have any comments to that question before we go to questions and comments in the audience?
well, I would just say that the public opinion is really responsive to a little bit of education about it, like people's knee-jerk reaction about people in prison being able to vote might be one thing, but if they talk it through a bit, they rather quickly soften their opposition because it starts to make sense. I did want to say something about, you know, when we talk about winning, every win is a team win, and I think it's, as folks have mentioned, directly impacted folks have really led the charge in some of the greatest success. And I know that you'll have Desmond Meade there, who is a tremendous leader and example for many of us. And then I wanted to mention that there's some real wisdom in the chat, and there's some folks talking about, well, how do we connect voting with some of these other issues, and how do we make sure people's voices are heard? That one of the things that I think getting Restore the Vote passed has helps us do is to see folks as fellow citizens, and not as other, and not as somebody, and not defined by their crime. You know, not as a dealer or a murderer or something like that. And this is really important. I would say the other issue in which this occurs is seeing folks living with felonies as parents. When you do that, it becomes much harder than to deny them air conditioning when it's 110 degrees in a state like Georgia. It becomes much harder to have subhuman conditions inside. When you think of folks as a parent or as a fellow citizen that you're going to be standing shoulder to shoulder with when they get out. And so that's where I think, you know, Restore the Vote is a great end in itself, but it also opens the conversation, and it is a wedge to help us think and really humanize the system in super promising ways.
Thank you. So I do want to invite people on Zoom to weigh in with a question so that we can get to it before we wrap up. But now I wanted to invite folks in the audience, if you have a question or a comment, a quick question or comment. There is going to be so much time over the next 2.5 days to strategize and talk. So now is not the time. But if you have a quick question or comment, I want to invite you all to share it. And I see Lee's hand is up. Can people just share it in the room, or do we need people to use the mic? Oh, I'll repeat it. Okay, so go ahead, Lee. Mm. You on a panel too, yeah, so. Okay. All right, so the question was, more curiosity around engagement post-win and in states, frankly, like Pennsylvania and other states where people can currently vote after incarceration, but ways to even, many years past a reform, but what are ways to engage them?
So I would quickly just say, one of the things that we also do here in Illinois is that a lot of us that are formerly incarcerated are able to go back in and just talk to the guys and the women about like the work that we do, the importance of like voting, civic participation. So that's one way. I think Stevie talked about the peer educators and making sure that people that are currently incarcerated, like that is actually like a tool for like their rehabilitation and reentry coming out the system. And then I think also we are like actively trying to fundraise to do more of the outreach in terms of like door knocking with this sort of mindset that we will operate in patience, meaning that we don't expect individuals in our first encounter to become like, okay, I'm ready. But in some cases that might happen. But what we want to do is those of us that have been impacted by the system, we want to be the messengers to the people that we talk to in terms of trying to engage them to engage themselves in civic participation.
I'll echo that. Ensure that the folks you want to engage post the victory are engaged in the lead up to the victory, and are like a fundamental core part, if not leading the campaign towards the victory. What we've done at Chicago Votes also is we've created an infrastructure for folks to plug into our work in a bunch of different ways. This is one element of our work. It's a huge element of our work, an important element of our work, but we also have a space for creatives. We try to make sure we have directly impacted creatives in that space. Shout out to King Musa. He's one of our creatives. He has a whole situation set up in the back with his paintings. He's a poet. He's a rapper. He's on our board. He's directly impacted. That's my brother. So like just making sure that like folks are not just being called on to, involve them in helping you win, but don't just call on them to help you win the thing that you need them to help you win. Like people who are locked up have a lot of dreams, have a lot of talent, have a lot of things that they want to do. We hoop. He can hoop. I got stuck guarding him one day. It wasn't fun. Musa can hoop. We just, bring people into your community is what I'm saying. And then like naturally your community will grow and it won't be such a challenge after the victory to try to like reach out to all these people. They're already your people. So
Chris, did you have any additional comments on the engagement piece that you've seen?
Yeah, I think it's tremendously important. I know the Minnesota Justice Research Center just released a report this week, I think, on efforts to get out the vote. I know it is there's sort of a longstanding problem of reaching folks. One of the big things that predicts turnout and actually exercising that right is stable housing. When you have an address, you're more likely to register. When you have an ID, there's many things we can do to help folks. I also think, it's important for all of us to recognize that there are active efforts out there to suppress the vote. Systematically to suppress the vote and to tell people who are legal and eligible to vote that their vote isn't wanted or to shoo them away from the polls. And so I think overcoming those barriers are important as well. And some of that means we have to shift the terms of the debate. I did an interview yesterday where they were asking me, well, what is the justification for people who've committed crimes to be able to vote? And I said, well, what is the justification for democracy? What is it? Why would we have a democracy? And if we didn't want the full inclusion of everybody who's affected. So I think turning some of that those tables around is important. And again, fighting the efforts to suppress the vote and to make sure people's voices aren't heard is front and center, just as expanding the vote and reaching out and making people feel included.
Thank you. So I think we have time for one more question. I wanted to see if there were any helpful, interesting questions on Zoom. So Brianna, or anyone, or Chris, maybe you were looking at the chat. I'm going to pull you in. Is there any questions that you want to bring out into the conversation? Sorry to put you on the spot. I guess not. No, there's a lot of comments. All right, well, we'll move on. I'm sure we'll look at the questions and we'll see, and we'll maybe bring them out later. Yeah. So what I hear in the comment is a question around an infrastructure that supports people's material well-being, freeing them from the constraints of continued criminal surveillance through expungements, information about reforms that might actually impact their post-incarceration experience. And that offers an opportunity for perhaps political education. So, and I think that that's can happen outside the community in terms of building that voting culture, and also inside for folks who are inside right today, today, long-termers, building that political education inside and then connecting it to conversations on the outside. So as we wrap up, because we have a few minutes left, Marlon, Stevie, do you have any comments in reaction to that?
No, absolutely. One of the biggest things we talk about is the improvement of like your quality of life. Like you should see that that progression like as you engage in this work. And I think to your point, that is absolutely like how we try to engage people, is just really giving them the information around how, when people say, well, how does this impact me? We provide the information and give them examples of how it impacts them. And we also share personal stories like, hey, I couldn't chaperone my son on a school field trip because of my record. And this is why we're mobilizing people, so that when we come out, individuals have an opportunity to be a full parent to their children. So I think that is absolutely correct in terms of like how we should engage folks, but we should also look at folks' quality of life. Are folks able to purchase a home if they want to? Can folks live where they want to, depending on like their income? But we look at those as measurements in terms of like, how is this improving an individual's life?
First off, shout out to Georgia. That's where my people are from. Got love for Georgia. What was that? You lock up president. Yeah, Georgia, ATL. No, that was epic. Yeah, I think recognizing as a civic organization that cares deeply about this community, that works deeply with this community, that is led by people directly impacted, that we have our capacity limits, and understanding that in order for us to provide the support that folks need beyond just voting, because like people who are locked up, people who have experienced incarceration need way more than just access to the ballot. So making sure we're in coalition with partners like Marlon, like a number of other folks we work with in Chicago and Illinois, to make sure we can serve as brokers to those communities that we work in, and plug folks in with the support that they need and with the people that can offer them that support. So we can just, do this communally. We can support each other, work together to do our best to give folks all of the things that they need. So.
All right, so that ends our open plenary. Thank you. Did Chris have you wanted to say something way in there?
I would just echo what you said, and Marlon and Stevie said, the coalitions that changed, restored the vote in Minnesota, also passed paid family and medical leave. There's a lot of things that, and I hope that in the next few days, you all can share stories from what has been working in one place and how we might import it in another, or how did you all get this done? That to me is the big question. And so I so appreciate the convening.
Yeah, how did you get it done? Yeah, so those are questions to go into the next session with, and tomorrow with, and on Sunday with. Bring answers, have good thoughts, and bring answers so that we can leave here and know how we're gonna expand the vote to the more than 4.6 million who are still in disenfranchised. So thank you all for being here. Thank you, Chris. Hope you feel better.
Thank you. Energized.
Thank you to those on Zoom.
I just want to start by saying I'm here as a guest to listen mostly. Nicole asked us to share a couple of things that we've learned through our time working together, but ultimately I'm here to listen, and I'm very honored to be here to listen. We are comms experts, but we're not criminal legal reform experts. We're here to listen and then amplify your voices. Again, here representing Marquee Communications Group. We are a full service marketing and communications group based, oh, I forgot, we got two clickers going on, based right outside of the Washington, D.C. area. We do everything from public relations and public affairs to creative design, brand positioning, that sort of work. And we really were founded a little over 4 years ago now, specifically to do inclusive communications, to make sure that all of the voices are represented. Even if there are only two target populations that the client may want to reach, we want to make sure that everybody actually is being reached in the way that they receive information. We view all marketing and communications campaigns as an opportunity to do that. And our mission is to bridge the communications gaps between being aware about something, knowing about something, being able to access that thing that you heard about in order to change your circumstances and be able to access opportunity. We were founded by 2 Black women and an Army veteran. I'm one of those Black women. The other is on maternity leave right now, so she wasn't able to be here with us. But again, I think you can see just based on our leadership demographic, we understand what it's like to maybe have a seat but not a voice at the table. And so again, we want to use communications to do that. Will, you still clicking for me? Yeah. Okay. All right. Inclusion, empowerment, and change are really at the foundation of the work that we do. There's definitions, the way we define those words, because shared meaning is important, particularly for this work. It's important to understand when you're using words, what do they mean? So I won't read the definition there, but again, inclusion, empowerment, and change. We will not take a client if there's not an opportunity to advance one of those 3 pillars. I am joined by Will Messinger and Janessa. They're going to go into sort of the meat and potatoes of the work that we've been doing with the Sentencing Project, but just sort of top level. We start with research and discovery. Again, listening always first. I never want to come in the room and tell you anything other than my name. I want to listen to what you have to say before I start adding and subtracting words, not numbers. I don't do numbers. So we identify target audiences, refine messaging, and then leverage research to make sure that what you want to say is well supported. We heard a number of speakers talking about the importance of data this morning. We've also been doing a lot of community collaboration. So as everybody knows, the Sentencing Project is in DC, they're a national organization, but the work is very local. And so when Nicole tells us there's an opportunity to mobilize on the ground, we're starting to participate in coalition calls and listening to what the posture, the attitude, the vibe is on the ground. And so we can make recommendations based on some things we've learned in other places. But again, we want to center what's happening locally and applying best practices that way. Strategic communications is a big word, just that basically means being smart about what you want to say. And so we leverage things like opinion editorials, positioning local spokespeople to talk on behalf of the people. We want to do this again to raise awareness, change hearts and minds when that makes sense, and ultimately to change policy, shape policy. And then lastly, we use some really smart science and digital. You know, I've been doing communications for a lot longer than I probably look. And when I started, things like billboard advertising was the best way to reach a lot of people at one time. But we've gotten smart over the last 15 years to understand that not everybody can read. So maybe, you know, hundreds of people are passing that billboard, but it's not resonating with them. Digital marketing tactics really give us the opportunity to target messaging specifically where people are getting their media. And so that science that those levers that we can't push on billboard advertising, we can push really well in digital marketing. So we'll talk a little bit about the success we've had with digital in this work as well. So from there, I'm going to let Janessa come up and talk a little bit about some of the narrative challenges that we've seen. Again, every state is different, policy is different, but because we've been working in a number of states, we've seen some themes and some trends around challenges. So Janessa.
Hey, everyone. Good afternoon. Glad to be here. So to Morgan's point, we've kind of noticed these narrative challenges. I'm sure you all are familiar. We've encountered, as y'all know, the presidential debate was this week, a lot of tough on crime rhetoric. It's feeling like 1996 around here. Lots of just stoking fear and using horrible, harmful tropes so that will end up fueling mass incarceration and further restricting voting rights. We're also running into misunderstanding around victims' rights. There's just a lot of assumptions from the press and policymakers that victims want harsh, lengthy sentences, but the research doesn't bear that out. What people want is solutions that allow them to achieve public safety. And that includes expanding the right to vote and allowing people to exercise their rights. The lack of access to information is probably the most troubling part. And I think we saw it in this last session where people who are incarcerated have no idea what their rights are. And a lot of that is not only just like a lack of access to information, but some of it is purposeful obstruction or just like a lack of prioritization from the policymakers and officials who'd be in charge of deciding these things, not letting people who were incarcerated or are incarcerated know what their rights are. It makes implementation a challenge, and it's something that we've seen across the board. And finally, progress yields backlash. You know, we've had victories in New Mexico and Minnesota, but we're also seeing rollbacks and attacks on voting in states like Virginia. As you all know, we had a global reckoning around criminal legal justice in 2020, and we're now seeing a kind of backlash to that kind of progress. But here's what's worked for us. Centering personal stories, like we noticed in the last session, that was super powerful. Having people who have experience and are personally impacted by these policies talk about their stories while leveraging the data that we have available to us allows people to really kind of empathize with that story and understand exactly what those impacts are. Utilizing unlikely messengers, such as, you know, jail officials, victims of crimes, people whose voices might be right of center, their beliefs might be right of center, but it helps make a dent in the narratives and the communities that we're trying to reach to push policy. Again, back to centering those local stories and really trying to humanize and bring a voice to these numbers. Talking to elected officials who are paying attention to their constituents and figuring out what constituencies they're paying attention to and what they're reading and what they're listening. And that brings us to our final, just considering elected officials' motivations. Again, looking at what they're paying attention to, figuring out what outlets they're paying attention to, what outlets are they going to, and using those outlets to help push policy and push messaging.
Thanks, Janessa. Hey, everyone. I know this is the after lunch session, so I'll try not to put you all to sleep. For everyone who's also on the live stream, you can feel free to plop questions into the chat and we will take those at the end. I'm just going to go through some case studies, which is a fancy way of saying stuff we've seen work over the past year. But as I'm sure a lot of you know, 2023 marks 50 years of mass incarceration in America, which is a really grim milestone, but has also been a communications opportunity for us. This is an evergreen news hook and a compelling narrative. And a lot of press doesn't really know that it's 50 years of mass incarceration in America. We all do. The national reporters who cover the criminal legal system might, but your average Joe in upstate New York, who's the beat reporter for his paper, he doesn't know that. So this has done a really good job of showing just how long this problem has gone on, but it's also been a great way for different groups to convene under this one banner. We were able to get media coverage, as you can see on here, out of launching the campaign, but it's also been something that we've added to all of the communications work that we're doing. When we're talking about a new report, when we're talking about a new legislative development, we can bring this up and just show how long this has really been a problem for. And so that brings us to some of the state-based advocacy work we've done, along with Nicole at the Sensing Project, but also with a lot of people in this room. Hosting local events to draw the attention of local press and other stakeholders has been really successful. You can see a nice picture of Nicole and some other folks there in Texas. Just doing that outreach to press ahead of time and making sure that people know the event is happening, that they're going, can really get people in the room and start conversations. Same thing in Pennsylvania here. We hosted an event in Pennsylvania. We reached out to press ahead of time, made sure they were there, gave them all the data and information they need to craft a piece that is really friendly to our position. And we do all that by leveraging a combination of human interest stories. We want directly impacted people front and center in all of this work, research as well, and the broader narrative, i.e. that 50 years of mass incarceration campaign. This is the work we really like doing because we kind of take a backseat and let you all lead. And that's kind of where we like to be. We've also had a lot of success leveraging research. We're lucky to work with the Sentencing Project because they do so much good research. A lot of other groups in this room do as well. And that research can make news. One of the things that we've found is you really need to present the data in a compelling way. Just sharing a big report with a reporter, they're probably not going to open it because they're busy. But so making sure that we're doing press releases that summarize the key points, doing targeted reporter outreach to make sure that those reports are getting in front of the right people. Research methodology can be really complex. So distilling those key points down and telling a clear story is really important. At the same time, so is making sure that you're not misrepresenting research. So when we work with different groups, we always like to make sure, touching base with people like Kristen and others who are doing the hard research, that we're getting everything right while still telling a compelling story. I wanted to talk a little bit about earned media. That's basically another fancy way of saying anything that is generated in the media that isn't paid for. You'll see a few different clips on here, but that can be anything from new legislation being introduced. You'll see in the top left, there's a story about a House bill that was introduced to restore voting rights to formerly incarcerated people. We put out a press release reacting to that. And a lot of the data and the quotes that we included in that ended up shaping the story itself. So that's a way that you end up with more favorable coverage. At the bottom left, you'll see Minnesota's vote to reintroduce felons as a victory for democracy. This isn't great because we don't love things like terms felons, right? That's a miss. But it is progress in that someone like Jennifer Rubin, who I won't share my thoughts on in this room, is saying that this is a victory. One other aside is the Sensing Project also has a great resource that we like to share with press about using person-first language. So when we see headlines like this, that is something we proactively reach out to them and say, hey, I know it means you have to have 2 other sentences or 2 other words in your headline, but it's worth it because you're being a generally good person. At the top right, you can see that you're also going to want to react to negative news stories. In reversal, some states make it harder for people with felony convictions to vote. That's a negative thing, but it's true. When those stories come out, we want to be in the news, shaping the story, letting them know why that's the case and calling people to account. Same thing in Virginia with what we've seen Governor Glenn Youngkin doing. Just some best practices onto working with the media. If there's one thing I can leave you all with, I think get lunch or coffee with reporters in your states. They will learn to trust you as a resource. I know since COVID happened, virtual meetings are a thing, but I can't stress enough how just knowing these people on a personal level helps with shaping stories. Even if they're going to write something negative, it'll at least help them balance it out. They are people too, and if you have those relationships, it helps a lot. Another thing is just to think in terms of headlines and key takeaways, asking yourself what I want someone to take from this story in less than 15 words. If they open an article and see it, 2,000 pages or 2,000 words, they probably aren't going to read the whole thing. But if you can get across the point that expanding voting rights to people with felony convictions can make my community safer, that's a huge win. Same thing with negative news. My local jail is preventing eligible people from voting. That's not a good thing. That is not a good thing. And that's what we want them to take away if that's the case. And then once you have a story that you're happy with, think about how you can continue to use it, whether that's sharing it with legislators via a handout, whether it's sending an email to them, whether it's putting out social media content from your personal channels or your organization's channels, or doing targeted advertising, which Morgan touched on a second ago. And I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. One other thing that we've been successful with is opinion editorials, op-eds. This is a great way where basically you submit a guest column to a newspaper. We have worked with organizers in Oregon, Maryland, Minnesota, just pretty much everywhere to write and place these pieces. You have full editorial control over what you say, so they can be very powerful and really carry your message. So here are just a few examples of ones we've done over the past year. And there's Justin. Digital advertising is something that is really successful. Justin, I'm sorry we didn't warn you before we put up this slide. You look great though. But it's really a way to reach targeted audiences repeatedly over and over again. I think research says people have to see something like 7 or 8 times before it really gets ingrained in their brains. And while it's extremely creepy how well you can target people online, it's also extremely effective. And the other thing that they can do is put pressure on legislators and their staff, even for the people who aren't persuadable. Some people are just not going to be moved by the moral argument. I don't know why, but they're just not going to be. But showing that there's grassroots pressure for your position and showing that their constituents care about this can be enough to motivate legislators to soften their stance. You're not always going to win hearts and minds, but you can pressure people to behave differently. And I think targeted advertising goes a long way toward doing that. With that, to Morgan's point earlier, we want this to mostly be a discussion. We want to hear from you what you're seeing in your states, what kind of coverage you're seeing, whether it's accurate, or what resources you all need to be successful when talking to the press. So I'll turn it over to Morgan to just kind of put a bow on things, but we really do want to hear from all of you.
Yeah, I hear Nicole from earlier saying only questions, don't get up here and give comments, but we are going to have a smaller workshop session tomorrow where I would like for us to kind of like have more of a discussion. And if you want to pontificate about what makes you so mad in your locality, I think that's a great opportunity for us to do that and then work together to collaborate on some action. But just for now, I mean, we heard Chris this morning talking about the predictors of success, and advocacy was on that list. And I would argue not just because I'm a comms professional, but just because that's what the data says. Smart thought partnership with good comms folks helps that advocacy really come to life. So I'm just curious, and I'll throw this out to everybody, and that includes those joining us virtually. what would you say are the biggest challenges to getting your message out there? And it could be anything. It doesn't have to have a calm solution, but I'm just curious to hear from you. What are those barriers? Is it funding? Everybody says I need more money. Is it that, journalism is shrinking in your locality and there's just not any good reporters that are covering criminal reform right now, criminal legal reform right now? Whatever it is, and I don't want to lead you, but curious to know that, because I think that will be a starting point for our conversation tomorrow. Yes.
I'm noticing that it's like a lot of times what we run into. So last year we had a campaign with Social Justice Center. We had tons of momentum and it was pop. And we got knocked down pretty hard. And now they're the new right? Cop City. So it's what we run into, and shout out to my South Cop City folks, love y'all. It seems like it is hard to garner the focus of our community, depending on what the issue is. If you guys front taking us out, that's what down here, right? Never mind the fact that there's people dying here and there's no publicity on that. Then we got South Cop City, and a lot of that attention is not even what like the positive and like what's being done in regards to community engagement and that, but people, media highlighting whatever else is happening surrounding that. Things that should happen. The things that should happen are also being highlighted, but not in the light that, I feel is appropriate. So what we run into, or what we're running into, is how to keep the discussion going in our community when there's like other issues that everybody's trying to tackle.
The noise. Yeah. Did you write this down for tomorrow?
I did.
Okay, we can unpack this further tomorrow. Please come to that session. But I think the short answer that I'll give right now is, regardless of what issue area you want to advance in the media, on social, you've got to find opportunity to link to something that is sexy, something that people are talking about. And so, Atlanta has so many, like you pointed out, so many things going on right now. And I would argue that criminal legal reform is at the heart of all of those things. And so, in peace times, trying to find opportunities to talk about it so that it's not so noisy. But then, like Will was saying, building relationships at your local outlets so that they know your name. You're not just one of 35,000 emails they got today. And coming to them with, a link to say, I was just talking to you 2 months about this issue. Let me show you how it connects to what's happening right now. And that they have to go to their editors and pitch, what you told them to say. And so the more substantive linkages you can make for them makes their jobs easier. Again, that's a really good point that I want to go into more tomorrow. Yes, Avalon.
They want to control, so they want message, they want there. So, and we don't have, we have some great, we got Tribe, we got Justice Watch, we have some great organizations that do reach out to us, but so many of the big ones, right? Only want they don't want to necessarily talk to us. They want to talk to us through the game. So that for us, our biggest obstacle locally is the gatekeepers that have us go and participate in those discussions on their terms and not necessarily on our terms.
I want to ask a follow-up question, not to call any of them out, but can you give an example of a gatekeeper? Would that be a larger organization? What do you mean when you say gatekeeper?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, all right. We won't call names. I think I understand what you're saying. That is definitely a problem everywhere. And again, it doesn't matter what issue area. Name recognition is what, wants to get quoted in a story. I will say though, this is a secret for our profession. It's easier to get a story placed when you have a local voice, a human interest connection to the story. And so everybody at the Sentencing Project knows this. It's never Morgan Dye quoted. I want somebody from the Sentencing Project quoted, and I want somebody that's local quoted, somebody like Justin, somebody like you, Avalon. That's what's going to get placed. And so to the extent that you can be offering these gatekeepers that want to center you when it makes sense for them, to in kind ask, can you be centering me for everyday media opportunities? The better. Pre-packaging resources for them that have your name on it, so they can't just use your words without your face there. We're going to talk more about that tomorrow. I don't want to spend a lot of time, but that is a very, we talk about human first language, but we need to be centering people to change the language. It shouldn't be somebody talking about this thing or this person. It should be that person telling their own story. Tomorrow as well, we have a room on the 4th floor, and we did a little bit of this with you, Avalon, in Denver last year. We're going to be doing just that, giving you an opportunity to speak directly to the camera about why you do this work, why other people should get involved with this work. Because again, I can say it's cool, I can say it's important, but I'm indirectly impacted, but I'm not directly impacted like a number of you all are here today. So that is going to be more compelling for us to play stories. Anybody else? Yes, sir. Mm.
My question tomorrow is, how do you navigate some, we get a lot of people who share, who do like little promos, little rescue promos on the Facebook page, that, about us or about who doing for long stuff. But how do we combat something like that without really posting, very sensitive stuff?
I would like to understand more about the power he holds, aside from the obvious, what his job is. Because that exposure is part of, I think, how we build awareness, that accountability piece. And for him to be concerned about what you all are doing is distracting away from, you know what I mean? Like what he's supposed to be doing. Yeah. Yeah. Protecting them. Yeah. 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 Mm-hmm. Yeah, just in case and I want Will to come too, just in case for some reason you can't make it tomorrow and make sure that question, I will offer this, that third party partnership. So sometimes partnering with organizations and you don't have any fingerprints on it, but they're carrying your message for you, can be an opportunity to do just that. Will, were you going to say something?
Morgan said what I was going to say. That's why I work for her. No, third party stuff. There are a number of ways to do that. Whether it's coming from a national organization that can take that heat. There are also times where strategically, from a timing perspective, it just doesn't make sense to do it right now. Sometimes you want to time that to maybe when that sheriff needs to be reelected, or at a sensitive time for him personally. Maybe that's when you take a month and say, okay, now we're going to go ahead and seize this opportunity and start laying into him for doing this. But I do think in the meantime, some sort of third party hands-off stuff could be a really good strategy.
Brianna, is there anything in the chat that we should know about? No? Okay. It's tough after lunch. I was wondering, is it harder to be the session before lunch or after lunch? We're going to see in the comments later. Apparently we're being graded on each. Yes, sir. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah, or even like a rural community where everybody listens to the radio. There's not really a major newspaper. It's a really good question, Ron. I don't want to give all my secrets away, but I will leave you with another opportunity to look to a national body like the Sentencing Project, because what could be possible is to build a trends sort of story, to connect what's going on in your locality in New Jersey to something that could be going on here in Chicago. And then that automatically opens you up to more outlets that you can pitch to. Everything is not national, right? But we are all in this room because there's a local problem with our nation. And so I bet there's synergy somewhere. There's somewhere we can align to, again, amplify the story. We're going to talk more about that tomorrow, Ron. What time is it?
45.
Okay. Oh, yes. Mm. Yeah, I will give my answer, and I know Will has thoughts about this. When he was talking about the 50 years public education campaign framing, we have been using that as a framing device for even the off election, so coming in November. So like we heard from the gentleman from Louisiana, I think there is a governor race there. So we're looking there first. And using 50 years of mass incarceration and all of the collateral consequences. You know, civic engagement is one, but there's so many others. But putting it under that banner to put a point in time, and you know, it's also the 50th year of hip hop, so that there's ways to kind of connect there. But I think last year when we did this work, there were midterms and other like more major elections going on, and we were seeding stories, you know, 9 and 15 weeks before about this is what we should be talking about. These are questions we should be seeding in debates, because they have, again, like I was saying to the young lady, they have connections to all of the other things that are being talked about, economic empowerment, all of the things that sort of keep you locked out of having a meaningful shot at capitalistic, you know, wealth starts here. And so that's what we're doing right now. I think we haven't really been seeding stories for 2024 because again, the noise there is too loud. But Will, do you have any other thoughts?
No, I'll just say anecdotally, talking to reporters who I'm pretty close with, and pitching them on stories are responding to me with one sentence and saying, the president just went to get indicted. Like, I'm busy. They're very busy with that right now, and that's totally understandable. But it's something we have to deal with. I think I saw a lot on social media, when Trump was, having his shot taken. People were drawing attention to, hey, if you're reporting on this, you should also cover the conditions in that jail. Right? So, and I think that really effectively broke through. I mean, just I had people who don't follow this topic who were saying, hey, you work on this stuff, right? So I think drawing those connections when you can to national news hooks can be really effective. We don't know if the former president is going to keep getting indicted, but yeah, I don't know. But this is a reality that we're going to be living with through 2024. So making those connections, and also, yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Opportunity there. There's also an opportunity there to draw attention to the 2 tiers of justice. We're seeing this man has been indicted 4 times and we just got his first mugshot. People get arrested for far less serious crimes other than overthrowing the federal government, and they get treated much worse. So to your point earlier about Fulton County Jail, that's an opportunity to then pitch reporters who are asking about that to draw attention to those conditions and ask them if they want to talk to somebody who has actually lived an experience inside of that jail. So just look at it as opportunities. It is annoying, of course, to have to always talk about that man, but it's also an opportunity to draw attention to our cause, that like, this is a clear example of what we're talking about.
Yeah. And, you know, we talk a lot about Trump, and so does CNN and everybody else. But, you know, I have a liberal, I know we're nonpartisan, but, you know, I'm a liberal, and I want to hold President Biden just as accountable. And so he should be also answering these questions as part of the debates that are coming. So I think it's leadership accountability. You know, again, everybody can get it because yeah. Yes.
It's predicted that young voters are gonna make up 48.5% of the voting population in 2024. And as far as like comms and press, do you feel like the platform of the press is shifting, or like if we're reaching out to newspapers, is that only reaching a certain demographic compared to, you know, social media?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and it's the demographic that you talked about, young people, but it's also literally the beats at mainstream news outlets are shrinking. So the person covering the State House is also covering criminal legal reform and social justice issues, and they get to write one story a day. So that is also an issue. And I think that that's why any campaign that you run has to be integrated. It has to be traditional earned media. It needs to be some paid digital, because not just young people anymore, everybody is consuming media on their mobile device. And it also has to be, and you know this because you're organizing at the local level, it is walking into churches and YMCAs and places where you need to look people in the eye and talk to them. Like that's, you know, still a great way to make sure that people are moving. So, you know, we just put a couple tactics up here, but any campaign that we want to recommend is going to have at least 5 ways. And again, we're inclusive. So we're thinking about the people that can't read, frankly, or maybe they read and they don't retain. So they need an audio message. So yeah, being diverse about the channels is more important than it's ever been.
Fortunately, you do kind of need TikTok.
That's where the youth is consuming their news and, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I mean, I failed on the skateboard too.
Okay.
But there's kind of tied into what you just said. I was gonna ask how are they reach it, you know, incorporating social media into your campaign, regardless of what they are, so that they try to
Yeah, absolutely. And it sounds like that's a resource that you all could benefit from. And that's something that we could easily put together. But just does this mean it's time to go?
We're about to get danced off the stage.
Right.
We're ending on a cliffhanger.
Right. It's like, the Sandman is coming. I was just gonna say, my general thinking around social for any campaign, unless it's, very, very targeted on social, and that's the main channel, is that to be your amplification tool. So that should be working for you to make loud everything you're doing over here. So when you place an op-ed, you need to reshare it on social and get all of your partners to do the same thing. But that's our homework. We're gonna put together a resource that just has some quick tips about how to leverage social media and all of its glory and not so glory to get it done. Yes. Yeah, so the question is about influencer engagement, having a celebrity or somebody that is well-known carry the water on the message. My colleagues probably have different thoughts. I'm a little older than them, but my general rule about this is, do they have an organic connection to what you want them to do or say? It can't just be that everybody knows their name, because they're going to botch the message if they're not connected to it. And so that's the prerequisite in my book. They're also probably not going to do it for free. So what kind of resources are we willing to commit to this? And what are our goals? Like, how can we guarantee that this was worth it? So these are the questions that I ask. I do think that there is power in having trusted voices carry messages, but I will say that what we call in our work 10 minutes. Thank you, Antonio. We call micro influencers. These are people that this is not like Steve Harvey, where everybody knows his name at this point. This is like somebody in the criminal legal reform space that everybody knows and trusts. I think that that can be more effective than having, Oprah validate your message. Anything to add to that?
No, I think that's the micro influencer thing is really important, because in this space, especially, you can tell when the messenger is authentic or not. And what you don't want is to leverage somebody who then it comes out that they've done something opposite in the recent past, especially if you're going to be investing resources into having them be your messenger. So to Morgan's point, I do think utilizing micro influencers who are already invested in the space, like an example for me would be Kendrick from Insecure. I can't remember what his full name is, but he does, and Kendrick Sampson, he's based out of Houston. He has a social justice organization. Using somebody like him, even though he's not the most famous, but he is already deeply rooted in that community and he has high engagement on these issues.
I saw a news everybody thought that happened. So since Trump is a big thought in the mind of America, what's happened about like down, all this, a lot of people how we see about that, and this criminal issue coming up from people actually being released out of prison. And I'm wondering how that can be a part of the discussion. I know it's not now, but I'm just saying that jiu-jitsu is a martial art practice where you can lift your opponent to your advantage. And I'm just trying to think outside the box.
Yeah. Let's talk about it more tomorrow. It's not a bad idea, for sure. It just takes some
Being thoughtful.
Yes, yes. Yes. Yeah. That's a good question. Do you want to talk about native advertising a little bit?
Yeah, I can talk about native ads. So first I'll start with, we have been, when we are really focused on one state and influencing legislation in that state, we will be shopping around multiple op-eds within that state to multiple papers at the same time. It depends on how many voices are available, but I am much more comfortable doing the work to draft something and have an editor tell us, no, we're full right now, or you just placed something 2 weeks ago. What, are you crazy? Than not doing it at all. So I would say, continuing to press, you don't need to wait a year. And you can try other outlets in the region. To Morgan's point about native advertising, this is a way of kind of making your work go a little further for you if you can put money behind it. Native ads are basically when you go on the Washington Post and you see a recommended article. It's not like one of those spam ones that's like lose 100 pounds in 2 days. It like looks like it's ingrained in the site and it will link to your op-ed. And you can target that to the people who you want to see it, whether that's legislators, their staff, or just the general public. So that's a way of like, say you place one you're really proud of and you want to get leverage out of it for the next month. You can do that in really targeted, effective ways.
That's like a 6-month kind of play. I wouldn't do that with your piece that's been in the ether for a year, but to Will's point, every 3 months is not too soon.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And an op-ed too can be a springboard to other press. 5 minutes, awesome. Yeah, op-eds can be springboard to other press too. Like just taking that piece and going in front of the people who are doing the local broadcast news and saying, "Do you want to talk to this person? Here's a great story we just put out. This is newsy right now." Is a great way to get extra mileage out of it. Yeah.
One of the things we see right now is with our local media is really a regression back to the 90s and like a lot of the harmful letters that y'all mentioned, especially with youth. I know a lot of youth as well, super predator and basic language. And the data just doesn't support the uptick in crime that they're alleging, and then just in crime in general. So one of the things we kind of figure out is like, how to make the data set. Like, I know you talked about like key points, but like hard to beat people over the head with like data, of course, it shows the ask. So like what's a good strategy for that really people, because the stories are sensationalized, especially like art thefts and things like that. So how do we balance that in terms of and things like that? It doesn't directly like respond to the supervision, but like also like doesn't be more life into that, but also like challenging that in a way that really looks cool instead of like that.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I was saying, I saw a recent example of this that I thought was very effective. Get the youth in front of media. I saw this piece in Philadelphia is having a lot of similar issues with how they're covering youth crime. And they literally talked to a group of kids who were basically discussing their circumstances and why they think things are the way they are and how they're combating that. And a lot of it is they don't have nowhere to go. We've taken away a lot of like third space, and the third spaces that are available are incredibly expensive. So making that the story, making it so you have young people who are directly impacted by the profiling, by the whole conversation around super predator, and like humanizing them to the audience, I think is a very helpful way of kind of countering that narrative.
Yeah, that's a great point. The analogy I was thinking of, it's the problem the Biden administration has right now is going out and saying, look how great the economy is. And we all feel like the economy isn't great, but except in this case, it's obviously different. But the thing that came to mind that we touched on briefly earlier was utilizing unlikely messengers. I think people who like sheriffs, jail officials, people who wouldn't necessarily assume to be on our side, but who are out there and who are willing to talk. Leveraging those voices, I think, can go a long way alongside youth as well.
Yeah, the only other thing I would add, and you may be already doing this because it's not a new trick, but visualizing the data as opposed to having it text-based seems to really, people take in information differently. And if I see, an infographic that represents a lot of people, but I see a word written out that says 1 million, it doesn't resonate in the same way. And so we do a lot of modeling with infographic and video, particularly if it's an annual report that the Sentencing Project does. So it's not like, you know, it's the same story and it's still, you know, bad, but the same people covered it last year, maybe like just presenting it in a different way. But yeah, what Janessa said is like so important. It's not the question you were asked, it's what you wanted to say. And so finding opportunities to do that is, whether we're talking about data or, you know, you just got a tough question from a reporter. One last question, because I'm not getting in trouble for going over.
Using that language. DC.
I'm gonna come talk to you about boxing after this, okay? Thank you all so much.
I'm going to bring you into the scary abyss called my brain, and then allow myself to travel into the scary abyss called your brain. That's my goal. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Avalon Betts Gaston. I am a Chicago native. Woo, woo. West Side. And I am also formerly incarcerated. I went to law school here, went to undergrad here. Like, I love my city. And until they shipped me to West Virginia for a year, and then to the middle part of our state for 3 years. And I've been an advocate my entire life. So I'm not going to talk a lot about myself. So, but I came home thinking that, like, this thing that we're doing through this system is not right. And we have to really make changes. And so I do a gazillion things. One of the things that we're working on here in our state is the ending of felony disenfranchisement for people who are, thanks to Stand Up America and Sentencing Project, I have this new language, who are completing their sentences in prison. So that's the message tested language. So to kind of give you, I want to kind of give you a little bit of the landscape of what we're dealing with here, which will help us to better understand the questions and that we're going to talk about. So you want to click. So grounding. As we tackle difficult questions, we want to ground the discussion in the reality that disenfranchisement has real consequences, right? And these are examples from our state. We have prison deaths. We've had guards literally drag people to areas in our prisons where there are no cameras to beat them to death. We have mental health issues. The federal courts here have literally held our Department of Corrections in contempt for failing to comply with providing adequate mental health care in our facilities. And that was just last year. And then we've had continued horrible medical care. We, like, I'm sure most of you all have prison systems that outsource their medical care to private care providers who provide horrible care. And so we've had issues with that. Wexford is the company that does that for us here. And so it's felony disenfranchisement allows this to happen, right? So like we have to connect the dots between the fact that the people in our institutions, our loved ones, don't have a voice. And so I just wanted to ground us in that space. So as we're thinking about how we want to respond to difficult questions, when people come and want to talk to us about, well, you know, why do you want XYZ to vote, that we have a why. And I'm sure you guys have these same stories in your states as well, right? Because that's just prison, right? Can we go to the next one? Oh, and now here's our latest one. We have a $2.5 billion bill that our state has to pay in repairs to our prisons because they have been neglected for years. We have some prisons in our state that are more than 100 years old that are housing our loved ones. And so, yeah, we got a 2.5, and those are pictures from our actual prison. You know, this has to be, well, so we, and let me put my disclaimer out there. I'm an abolitionist, right? You may not be an abolitionist. I am. So everything that I'm talking about is coming from, I want to shut this ish down. Okay. So that is a bill, but I, and a lot of us are arguing, let's close some of these prisons instead. Our population is low enough that, and I hate saying this, worst case scenario, we could ship people to other, consolidate into institutions and close our worst, the worst institutions. So our argument is to close our lovely governor who responded with, we're not closing any prisons, but I could show him better than I could tell him. So the landscape, what's some of the best language? What are some of the lessons that we've learned? And what are some effective messaging strategies? Now, I'm saying that within the context that we have not passed our bill yet, right? So we haven't had our success, but we have been working on this. And I personally have been involved in trying to restore the right to our incarcerated neighbors for 3 years. So it's been ongoing for about a decade. Go ahead, next one. There we go. So here's what I wanted to do today is these are the top questions that I hear when I'm talking to our representatives about voting in prisons. We call it the VIP bill. And so I wanted to share these questions with you, and then I'm going to share some of the responses that I've had, but I want you to be thinking about, like, what are some of the responses that you would want to come? How would you respond if you got this particular question? And how would you tie it to something in your state? What's going on in your state that you can tie this question to with an answer to explain to them why they need to end felony disenfranchisement? So this is not, I mean, I'm not giving you homework. I just really want this to be more like a discussion, that we're sharing information amongst each other. Because I feel like for me personally, that's when I do my best work, is when I'm doing it in community, right? And so I wanted to do that. So this is not going to be like a typical thing. So the first question. Take 5 minutes to read the question and kind of think about it. Yep. Yep. Hey, I think the answer, I say, because I think all of us have different effective messaging for each state, but some states are, to racial justice message or reform message. So I do think it would be a good idea to hear from you all as far as how you answer this question. Absolutely. And we have a small enough group that I think we can really kind of go around and share if everybody is okay with that. If you are uncomfortable, and let me say this, and people online, if you have something that you want to throw in the chat, please let us know. I am big on you presenting and being fully present in the space, however that looks. So if that looks like, I don't feel like talking today, that's how that looks. And I'm totally cool with that, right? Like, so, and there's no judgment for me or from me in that space, but I'm really big on us being able to be who we are in that moment, wherever we are. And so I like to foster that type of environment. So if today's not your day to talk, just say, not my day, and I'm good. Or, I don't have anything to say. I'm not trying to put you on a spot. Yes. You like that? Oh, okay. There you go. I'm gonna come closer to you so the people online can hear you.
MVPs are the most vulnerable people, but they should be the most valuable people. They should be the people that we respect the most, I'm talking about disabled people. I'm talking about LGBTQI people. I'm talking about folks that are impoverished, like poor, like born that way. My mom was pregnant with me in jail. I know poverty personally. I know how hard it is. I was locked up. When Obama won election in 2008, I couldn't vote because I was in the hole. And at the time, I wasn't even proven guilty of a crime. I hadn't even been to court. I was pre-trial. So the first election I could have voted in, a black man won. And my mom used to play Tupac. She used to play Changes. Although it seems heaven sent, we ain't yet to see a black president. And I'm thinking about my mom in there, Christmas. I missed my 21st birthday in jail. And that election, not being a part of that when, everybody was talking about hope, and the guards announced on the speakers, the intercom, because we could hear it, they said that Obama won and I'm in the hole. So I'm like, as a young man, young black man, especially at the time, I didn't even know who Sammy Young was. Sammy Young got shot in the head trying to register people to vote, trying to desegregate bathrooms and all that. I didn't know who Medgar Evers was. He got shot in the back through his heart. I didn't even know why Dr. King was in Memphis. I didn't know about those 2 men being killed in the back of that trash truck. So the history, the honor, the respect, the dignity that folks that are locked up still don't have. The MVPs, the most vulnerable people, the most valuable people, the VIPs, the very insignificant people. We gotta do everything that we can to make sure that voting in prisons and people that are in prison being able to have this voice, because that's what a vote is, this choice of who represents them. I'm thankful to be here. And question one, why should murderers, rapists, and child molesters have the right to vote? Because they're people, most vulnerable people, actually.
Thank you for that. I appreciate that. So, oh, we got 2 mics working. All right. Anybody else want to add? Go ahead.
Yeah, to the first one, I would say, in any democracy, you're going to have plenty of people who you may not think should have the right to vote. Maybe they're members of the Klan openly. Maybe they're openly members of Black Lives Matter. But you think like, oh, well, we shouldn't have people like that voting. But the part and parcel of having a democracy is that everybody gets the right to vote. There's going to be people you agree with, people you disagree with, people you think that maybe aren't smart enough to vote correctly, or they can't, they have some sort of disability or whatever. And so various people are going to have a take on that. And the reality is, where I'm from, that group of people represents far less than 1% of the amount of people who vote. Now, if there's a group of people that you disagree with, that you think shouldn't have the right to vote, and they add up to about 51%, 55%, well, now you got to take a deep look about like where you live and your views on who should or shouldn't vote. But a tiny little group of people, that's just the price we pay, that there's going to be some folks that you disagree with having the right to vote that I may agree with, and it could be vice versa.
Does anybody else have anything? Go ahead, Ron.
Yeah, I've actually had all 3 of these questions on numerous occasions, but there was one leadership chief of staff asked me. Now, Megan Kanka was a little girl that was raped and killed by Temendekwas, right? So the question that was presented to me that made me like, maybe it wasn't the right answer, but it was the right answer for me, is he asked me, he said, how am I going to tell Megan Kanka's father that I gave the right to vote to Mendekwas, Megan's rapist and murderer? And I said, well, maybe you just tell him you didn't have the right to take it from him to begin with, So for that first question, I think the narrative has to be on the point that human rights, and it's defined in the 1947 human rights thing from those skinny building in New York. Right. And that was like one of the greatest things that my brain is terrible on names, but the president's wife, God, what's her name? Well, she wrote part of Bill, the thing, and she said that was her greatest work, to make human rights, the human rights bill, and to specifically put voting as a human right in that bill, right? Well, if it's a human right, when you take something away, you say that person is not human. And so if it's a human right, then you should have it. And since we ratified that thing, the United States said voting was a human right.
So for me, it's on. Hello. Good morning. Good morning. All right, I'll just speak up. Okay.
So for me, when people say, why should murderers, rapists, and child molesters have the right to vote? First of all, should and right shouldn't be in the same sentence. If it's our constitutional guaranteed right as a birth citizen, as a resident who has taken the oath to be a citizen, they should have every right to vote. Not one person in here lives above sin. So if you're judging my sin based on these three things or whatever issue you base it on, you're saying that you absolve yourself of any responsibility for the sins that you commit. But in our state, 95% of individuals who are incarcerated come home at some point and they're expected to pay taxes. They're expected to be what we call upstanding citizens. Nobody else is expected to be an upstanding citizen unless you are charged with this felony or this conviction that lives with you for the rest of your life, unless you have the ability to have expungement or record clearing bills in your state. But the 95% of people who come home are our neighbors, are our brothers, our sisters, are my loved ones. And I feel safest with those people because they are my community. And I've found a way to give them the resources to make sure that they don't reoffend. And they guarantee me my safety. They guarantee our communities our safety. The people who took away in the 80s, 90s, 90s, 2000s, whatever, people who have went before a judge and or jury and were sentenced to a crime, did what they said was sufficient punishment for whatever crime that is. When that is over, do we continue to use that against them? And if you are a person of faith, because we hear this a lot, we hear second chances and redemption, and nobody talks about the fact that resources are removed from our communities and some people don't get a first chance, right? So if we talk about the human nature of it, and that is what it all boils down to, you don't get the opportunity to judge when it's fit for you. And because this is a right, it should not be tied into who should and who shouldn't. It should be unabridged at any point in time, but we take the authority to say, I am God and I choose who gets to participate in democracy. I will make decisions about everything from the quality of water or soil or education or school board and policies around this. But if you have been deemed a person who is morally unfit, and I think this kind of goes into question 2, we should take a thing away from you that is considered to be your God-given right by our Constitution and tell you that you still have to be an upstanding citizen. So when we talk about safety and we talk about voting, a piece of paper was never the problem. People are the problem. People having less than sometimes are the problem. We talk about the 12,000 people who come home from our Virginia prisons every year. We talk about the history of slavery and how it started on the banks of Jamestown, and our 1902 convention said we are doing everything in our power to remove the votes intentionally from Black people. And we say that if they're convicted of a crime, there's a moral standard that says that you're not able to make decisions about a thing. But we have to think about the fact that slavery was legal at one point. So tell me how your sin is not greater than mine when we talk about taking away a person's right. We want to talk about this all day, for sure. Let's move to question 2.
I actually don't have an answer for the questions because, well, hear me out just for a sec. When I looked at the questions, automatically the first thing that came to my mind is who's asking these questions, right? And to take it back, I'm not sure how many of you have ever heard of like a discipleship wheel or like a maturity wheel, right? Where you have like like it's cut up into 5 sections. There's 4 big sections and there's a little small sliver. And the little small sliver essentially is like the spiritually dead or people who don't know. And then there's, you know, the baby stage, the infant stage, the young adult, and then the parent stage, right? And the reason that's important is because when you're looking or you're listening to people, you can kind of determine where they're at maturely, right? Like in their maturity level. And you can determine whether or not they're a baby. And in a baby, you're going to give them milk. You're not going to give them meat. You're not going to tell them exactly what's going on because they're not going to even digest that. Right. And when you're talking to somebody who maybe has a little higher maturity level, and you can kind of say, oh, well, this person's more of a young adult. Well, a young adult, you do want to correct them, right? You don't have to teach them the rules and regulations because they should already know. A young adult, or excuse me, maybe an adolescent, you have to teach them and egg them on a little bit, give them a little bit more meat, right, as they're learning. And when they become a parent, is because it's a parent. that they can now go out and make children. They can go out and make disciples or go and talk to people, right? I like to use that wheel when I'm engaging with people because just listening to the questions, they're conducive of somebody who's already leading the conversation. Because I've always was told, hey, the one who asks the most questions is the one who's leading the conversation. So what I would answer when I read these questions is I would ask with another question for more clarification, because people don't know that people don't care if people don't care that you know, or I forget the saying, right? It's people don't really care that you know until they know that you care, something like that. And so that's kind of how I approach it, because just thinking about number two, the right to vote is part of a contract citizens have with society. Okay, so what contract? And by saying what contract, what I'm going with that is I'm going to say, hey, well, what are laws? Where did you learn law? Because I'll tell you what, I got stories for days about people who didn't even know what the law was until they broke it. And so wherever you're learning the law, I'd like to know, because I'd like my kids to go to that or to learn that too. I'd like my parents to learn that too, or to at least have it translated to them in Spanish. You know what I mean? Because it's like, how do you know you broke a law until you broke it? You don't, unless you went to school for it. So essentially, that's kind of where I go with listening or thinking about these questions, because a lot of the questions, they're just loaded. They're just like, why should murderers, rapists, and child molesters have the right to vote? Why should you have the right to vote? And then essentially that's.
No, I think you bring up very valid points, because to your point, when Avalon and I were coming up with a number of questions, most of these are questions that come from people that are in power, legislators. So these are the type of questions that they ask. And you also alluded to the point that many of them are ridiculous, like they're irrational questions.
I want to answer to that too. They're irrational, but the reality is that they're coming from a position of power, right? So these questions are coming from people who have power, and they want to mete out that power in a way that absolves me, because I'm not looking at the man in the mirror. I'm looking at the other people, and then I want to pass judgment on them. And so for me, and a lot of people are, icked out by people who have committed harm that results in the loss of a life or a rape, or who have harmed children, right? People struggle in those areas, like emotionally, they struggle. And we've been indoctrinated, right, to think that these are the worst of the worst. Have we not? So the worst of the worst, it's okay to treat them a certain kind of way, to deny them rights that they should have. It's okay because it makes me feel better, because what they did makes me feel icky. I feel bad or angry, right? So all of these questions have come from Illinois electeds. Actually, question one came from our people on our board of elections. And then question two has come from a lot of our electeds. So does anybody have an answer that they would want to present to question number two? I know you.
I think for question number two, when I actually like during our last public hearing, I went through the testimonies and like highlighted some of these, and I'll do a presentation around them, because it's all rhetoric with no thought process to it. So, and people are okay with that because it just upholds what they're comfortable with. But when someone asks like this so-called contract with society, I was like, well, who was in the room? Which society? Because if you come to my community, no one agreed to this. No one agreed to have what is inalienable removed, because that's equivalent of saying that if I break the law, you can take my citizenship. And you need to show me that in the contract. There is no contract. If I'm born here, if I'm naturalized, I'm here. There's nothing you can do about that. So how is it that you can take the essence of it? And we didn't agree to that. And that is a conversation. I think you, at the end of the day, with all these questions you run, it's going to boil down to you calling somebody a racist, and then figuring out, now what do we do with that? Right? What do we do if you're racist? Let's have an honest conversation about that. And that's damn near impossible to have, because they're going to defend why they're not a racist and why this is logical. And it's like, it's just not.
Anybody else?
So, this applies to what I want to say applies to all of these questions, which is you don't answer these questions. If you watch a politician on television being interviewed who's asked difficult questions, they never answer the question. They just reiterate their talking points. And I really think that's what we should do. Someone can ask you that question and you tell them why universal voting is critical and why it's needed and necessary. Because someone asks, just go back to what was repeated, someone asking those questions aren't on our side and we're never going to convince them otherwise. But if there is a broader audience who's listening to what we're saying, we want to focus our time and the talking points that we know are effective and not trying to address distracting questions that ultimately if someone's asking that question, they're against us and they're trying to undermine our arguments.
I'll share two responses that I've heard to question number one from someone, and I made a note of it. The first question is that because I want to be safe when they come home. Shut them down. Because I want to be safe when they come home. The other question, the other answer, I was like, well, all right then. The other one came from a person that does DV work. And they said, you know that the vast majority of rapists are voting now. And I was like, okay. It was crickets after that, because the vast majority of rapes aren't even reported, let alone solved, prosecuted, and people arrested and served time. So they were like, they're already voting. So I'm living with that right now. What difference does it make? We should just get rid of it, get rid of this game to say we want to have this small group of them to not vote. I was quiet after that because I was like, well, what do you say to those two answers? Which I thought, I'm not saying, and I agree with you, they don't deserve answers, but that was two responses that I did hear from people that shut the person, like they had nothing to say after that. Go ahead.
I had a question too asked of me by Tucker Carlson once, actually. And I'd run into him. I was only out maybe like a year. I was working backstage. I was going to college and we were working on a campaign in Rhode Island. So it was a statewide ballot amendment. And I was like, and he had just done this event where he was talking about democracy and whatnot with James Carville. So I was like, oh, I'm going to, maybe try to get his take, we were just, the funny part about it too is I didn't know that my mic was open the whole time. Like, so all my colleagues here in this convo, but I said, Tucker, blah, 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 what do you think about people having the right to vote? And he's like, oh, I'm totally against it. He was all cash. And he goes, he's basically question two. And he said, people who have committed crimes have shown that they have poor judgment. And, and that poor judgment, should not impact my democracy. He was very kind of smug with it. And I said, well, I've been in prison. I feel like I have pretty good judgment. And he goes, oh, what were you in prison for? And I said, I did 12 years for murder. And, I think I'm civically engaged. I'm up on the issues. And, I really think that by encouraging people to vote, you're actually encouraging them to be part of society, to do the right thing, be more involved and engaged. And by not encouraging people to vote, by saying you're not allowed, you don't belong here, you're just pushing people into the corners and under the bridge where things like, black market economies and depression and addiction and anxiety take root. So like, which one do you want to encourage? People to be engaged and involved and part of society and do the right thing, or the reverse? And, later that night or next day or whatever, his producer called, wanted me to be on his show and basically like have our conversation back and forth all over again. So, and at the end of his show, he closed it by saying, well, there's a man who's, I forget how he said it, but something about like, may everybody who comes out of prison be kind of as doing the right thing as this guy, kind of. So, he's a little more wackadoodle now, but the point remains. I feel like when you don't engage with them and we just like throw stones at each other from behind brick walls or whatever, I feel like we're not, I feel you do that when you're not right. Like the politician who does I'm just going to stick to my talking points and bypass the question. And then sometimes you hear the moderator on some show like re-ask the question, they duck it again. and it's like everyone knows you ducked it. I just feel like that is what you do when you're not right. When you're right, you try to get like, okay, let's talk it through. Let's have it out. And the one that we won with both in Rhode Island and in Louisiana was pretty much that argument of, what do you want to encourage people to do? The right thing or encourage them to do the wrong thing? And whether someone's convicted of murder or rape or some serious crime like myself, you know, those are exactly the people you want to encourage to do the right thing. And so I say, do you want to encourage more crime or less crime? You tell me.
Exactly. So now that can take us to question number 3, which we have actually heard, especially about our voting in jails efforts. Won't prison gains undermine ballot integrity, and how can you protect the ballot? So what would your response be to that?
Well, first, can I ask a question?
Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Why everyone is from different states? I don't know where everyone's from, but is there anyone here working on jail-based voting like that has outside of? Okay. Have you all ever experienced like this question as you all are?
We've gotten the ballot integrity to the top point. We haven't gotten prison gains, so it's all from a point where it's like, can you explain to me like ballot integrity? It's a buzzword.
Yeah.
You know, like what do you mean? Like that the gangs would stand there and like, okay, you vote, then they hand it to the second. Is that how it works? That like, yeah, that's how it works with food. That's how it works with food. Like, that's actually how that's out.
I have to define a gang. It's a group of people who come together and abide by bylaws to protect resources, right? Sounds like democracy to me, right? It sounds like Republicans and Democrats and any other party.
Sounds like cops
Sounds
and
like-
COs.
Sounds like everything. So how do you undermine the ballot issue with those who have already defined how they choose to live and have already figured out amongst themselves a democratic system, right? So you can't undermine a ballot integrity, especially in states where you don't really have any good options. Like they're all struggling to find a good option to vote for. So they should be able to at least voice what's wrong. And I think beyond gangs, the one thing gangs all have in common is that they're all in prison. Like in prison, gangs are in prison. They don't have different issues. They have the identical issues. They may have conflict, but when it comes to issues, they're not just, they're completely aligned. They have bad food, they have bad healthcare, they have bad resources, they have poor education opportunities. This is universal. So you can't undermine. Voting is probably the one unifying part of prison that you can actually get. You might solve more gang issues by having a stronger democracy in your prison system than thinking that they're going to anyway undermine it and do what? Like rack up votes for Trump? Like we're going to make sure that everybody in here votes for who? Like they have poor options. Like,
Yeah. And I think underlying all of these questions, right, is this judgment of who's deserving and who's undeserving, right? And so for some odd reason, when you're thinking about the prison gains, well, we don't want to live by whatever decisions they may make, right, as voters, because they may be thinking about supporting a candidate that we don't support, right? And one of I think that comes into play a lot, especially in prisons, because people are afraid that they're going to be voting in the community where the prison is, right? Which are generally not the communities from where the people that are in those prisons come from, right? So, oh, we don't want you impacting me as a CEO, I don't want you impacting my local elections, right? Because that means you are a person that I have deemed less than human can have an impact on my life. Whereas now I only have an impact on your life, right? So it's this power dynamic at play in all of these questions, right? And we have to kind of get to that. And how do you deal with the power dynamics at play with these particular questions? And so, there's no real like right answers to this. You just have to kind of think about like who's in front of you. Is that a relationship you want to continue or need to continue? Right. because I may not be able to be like, that's a stupid question. I'm not answering that. Right? If I'm gonna need your vote on this other bill I got coming up, right? You know, so those type of things. So, but go ahead.
Well, I was gonna say, and like this is probably also specific to me because I don't live in a state, I live in DC, and we did this. So like I think there's also precedent, right? Like we did that and then had 2022. Like there are states or non-states like DC that have worked to restore the right to vote and don't have these issues. In a place, a city like DC, if there was even one little thing that people could pick at, as they always do in the city, where there was like not great integrity in the ballot, that would have come out immediately. Like immediately. People in DC are insane. And so like we have gone through major election cycles where we don't have this issue. And I think that's something that you can point to, is like, this is not an actual issue. And I think in some of the other states, this lives in the hypothetical, which is fair because we're obviously doing that work right now. But DC is a place where you can point to that it doesn't live in the hypothetical. We already know this is like a bullshit question.
And you can go to Puerto Rico.
Yeah, true.
Vermont, Maine, right? Like those states that never took the right to vote away, they don't have these issues, right? Because if they did, we'd know about it. Oh my goodness, we would know about it, right? So
I mean, I think like to Avalon's point and other people said, like the actual logistics of voting would not allow you to like stand right next to someone and do that. But both just as you vote, like as I would vote in elections, I can't go to my polling place and have someone right behind me like watch me vote. You can't do that in any democracy. That's wouldn't be a democracy. And so I think like people I think assume and probably don't have access to DC prisons and Vermont prisons and Maine prisons to see the actual logistics of what would happen in terms. I think some of these questions also allude to the thinking that there might be like persuasion behind the scenes, but like that's the same as mailers and all of these other things. Like there's persuasion in elections all the time. That's why you get 1,000 ads every election cycle. So if people are talking to each other, just as I would talk to my friends about like what I'm thinking and issues that I'm voting for, people can talk, but like when someone goes to the ballot to vote, they go on their own to cast their vote just as anyone else would. I think people unfortunately think that this would be a different situation because they have not taken it upon themselves to actually look at how have Maine been doing this since 1865 or something. Like I'm sure if there was a massive issue, would have made a change. I think that's something that.
And even before we started doing felony disenfranchisement, right? Like we had all of these groups voting.
I think what she's talking about is, I mean, well, what we're all talking about, and your amazing explanation you just did, you might have got cut off about halfway through if you were the one doing it. But if you were a legislator, you would be able to, go into it. And so it reminds me, how important it is to have our champions well-versed in these answers, because they're the ones that can shut it down or take the privilege, or if they're the ones that are actually the chair of the committee or whatever, and they can direct traffic. We're like in a line trying to respond, and then they're talking, stupidity into the air, and then like case closed, and we don't get a chance, maybe 2 minutes, but maybe we already had our chance. So they can do the responses and retorts. So you got to put a lot of time into, sometimes you're well-intentioned, but not on top of the nuances, champions on bills and legislation.
Yeah. So like, I know we always we throw around like Maine and Vermont, like Maine and Vermont still vote. Maine and Vermont do a horrible job, right? The Vermont has an extremely high illiteracy rate. The guys in there don't engage, like they have a right that is really they have access to the right, this is really use it. So like there's a difference between enfranchisement and engagement. They have no engagement, right? But I think probably the best system to look at and then look at why it's no longer existing is Massachusetts. Like when you talk about will a gang impede? No, you had a prison form a pack, and then the governor hold a press conference from the prison stating that they are removing the right to vote from these incarcerated folks. Right? They came together. They decided they were going to actualize democracy, and now let's have that conversation. What is your fear? Not around people who have made bad decisions, but people who have taken the thoughtfulness to actually push democracy. What is the fear?
Right? Like,
Yeah.
so all the way up until 2000, people in Massachusetts with felony convictions who so-called broke their contract with society, who may have been convicted of murder or rape or child molestation, and who may have actually been in the gang in the prison, were voting. And there were no issues with their ballots. So just use, this is a non-issue. And so the answer is that is a non-issue, because where people vote in prison, this has never come up. And so it's not going to be any different in our state than it's been in all of the other states that have those particular rights. And so it's just really interesting to get back to Brother Jeter's James his statement that this is really coming from a place of white supremacy and racism. And so how do we get there? How do we get and deal with that issue in that conversation where it may be a power dynamic between you and your elected, and you're like, okay, wait a minute, I'm going to need this vote on a later bill. How do I manage this moment to maintain that, right? But when you think about it, they're just trying to find reasons to deny the right to vote, because in their mind, the person who's not voting is a person of color. And they don't want to say that.
Yeah, to the point of this whole discussion, something that came up when it was being discussed over here is that our legislators go into these caucuses where they talk amongst each other. So maybe part of what we need to do as advocates to try to give them the weapons they need is we need to put together the frequently asked hard questions with talking points and responses that come from our research and our work to help them be able to understand that these questions are coming through the ignorance of not understanding. Here is the responses that you can give. And by giving it to them, maybe we further our own goals, because they will be talking to them in caucus where nobody hears them but the caucus, where they could be more themselves. Because we have some legislators in Jersey who, when they're in front of like when they're having committee meetings and they know that they're on stage, they're completely different than when you speak to them privately. So being able to give the right responses for our champions that are going there in the caucus, maybe we get further.
I think that's a nice segue into it's on a previous slide, but one thing that we are going to share, and we'll have more of this tomorrow in the communications workshop, is a document, a narrative document, so that we all know how to message on this. And this is from message testing that we did with Sentencing Project 6 and Common Cause. And so this is all messages that have been tested, but I wouldn't say they are necessarily the best because we've only done it one time, right? Like, I think that this is the type of testing and polling that we need to continue to do, because language evolves over time, the issues evolve over time, as well as people in power, they change. And so that message is also going to change as well. But we are going to also now consider a document that talks to, or that is specifically tailored to legislators so that they know how to talk about this. Because we've talked about giving this to the media as well, because the media needs to know how to talk about it. And then as well as ourselves as advocates, how do we stay on the same message for the most part, as a collective? Because I think sometimes we can undermine each other in the language we use, and not intentionally, but just kind of like, some folks might be using language that is not effective in other places. And so that can sometimes undermine the other work as we are trying to build a national movement around this. So to that, we are going to create a document. And please hold us accountable to that. If you all don't see something in the app or the follow-up, we will be providing that. And if you don't see it, please reach out to somebody on the planning committee. All right.
Do we have any questions online? Any comments or questions online?
That's a huge, that's a big talking
That's a
point.
big talking point. If they look right, they still remain citizens.
For sure. We have 10 minutes left.
Yep.
I don't know if you wanted to leave this open for, if there were any other ridiculous questions that you all have
Right.
gotten.
That's why I wanted to open it up to see what ridiculous questions have you heard as you talked about this issue?
It's not so much a ridiculous question, but it's kind of like, I'll just let you know how we ended up with a little bit of a compromise to get our bill passed in Louisiana. There was this idea from, the right-wing people, that there should be like this kind of cooling off period, this, you kind of got to earn it, to spend some time after you've been out. So like we already had, the law was already, if you were finished with your time, your parole, your probation, whatever, you could vote. And so as we knew, most people who got parole had a short parole just because the way we work it. And so you only did maybe 18 months or 2 years, whatever. So they were really into this like 5-year waiting period. And so, and it was like the year before, a couple of them had suggested like, well, if there was like a waiting period, we'd go for it. And so the next year we came back and we went for this waiting period. But the funniest part about it is what they were missing was the fact that it was only going to apply to people coming out of prison on parole, right? If you're off parole, you're good. And if you had gotten sentenced to probation, you'd be good. And so by them thinking that everybody had, and then the problem with it came to the community was everybody was stuck on this idea. And this is like voting rights people around the country, even though I was correcting everybody, and I won't name any names because they might be here, correcting a lot of people's stuff that would say like, you have a 5-year waiting period after your release or you're finished. It's like, no, that only applied to about 2,500 people statewide that were on what we call long-term parole. And instantly about 40,000 people on probation, including myself, got the right to vote. And so they actually came back and felt like they got hoodwinked. And so, and as they were saying all this stuff, and there was this like special hearing and stuff. And I said, we can review the game tape. I know y'all are Saints fans and you watch tape after. I was like, I know exactly what I said. We can see what I said when I explained this issue. And all of a sudden they was like, no. I don't think they were even sure, but I was saying very authoritatively, but all I'm saying is like sometimes, and we always talk about like concessions or compromises. If we didn't go for that, we were not going to get anything passed. And since that time, we've actually made it a little bit better and a little bit better. And now we've got some litigation to, hopefully make it even better than that. But a lot of it was like people that had this idea that like, well, you can come back to society, but you got to kind of have to earn it. And so that was like our debate ground, it was like, what does it mean to earn it? And the thing that ended up becoming now it's not even really a question about people with probation, but over time, people came to realize that probation is an alternative to confinement. The judge tells you, do the right thing, be a good citizen, pay your taxes or whatever. And you go right back to the street. It's not like you had this whole 20. And I try to encourage all of our folks that talk about any type of thing that impacts people's criminal records. Stop saying when people come home. Most people who suffer criminal record discrimination in whatever context suffer it from probation. There's like 3 to 1 wherever you're at, like probation to prison. And so those folks, they might have got convicted yesterday and now they're dealing with housing or voting or other types of discrimination tomorrow. Another person might have got convicted 25 years ago and now they're dealing with the discrimination. So if you're the person trying to present yourself, is it better to say 25 years ago I killed someone as I was a teenager, or to say yesterday I stole 5 bicycles and sold them to some kid? I mean, they're both kind of tough to deal with in that moment. And so going back to your point about like language or whatever, figuring out how to kind of correct each other in a way of like, let's be mindful of the words that we're using. Are we accurately, or as a man who did time, am I thinking like the guys? Because I've been saying that in prison the whole time. It's like, no, the men, women, and children, and so like, we got to encourage ourselves to be sure that we're talking about the right people dealing with the right issue. Sorry for all that.
And we have 5 minutes. One thing I want us to be thinking about as well, and this is a very easy talking point that comes out and flows very easily, is that somehow losing your right to vote is a part of your debt to society, right? Like, it's not. And we have to stop saying that, right? Like, okay, well, once I pay my debt to society, I should have my right to vote back. My right to vote is not a part of any debt that I owe to the society. It is a right that I am born with, or that I have as a citizen of this country. And I don't have to put it up. I don't have to ransom it or put it up as surety for a punishment, right? Like, it's not like I got to put my house up for my mortgage and I don't act right. I don't pay my bill. Somehow I lose that. Like, it's not the equivalent. And but it comes so easily out of everybody's mouth. Like, oh, well, I paid my debt to society, so I should have my right to vote back. Like, it's not, it should never be a part of your debt, period. Because that's not the debt that you owe society, giving up the right to vote, right? So that's another language issue.
46 years, man. We just got out of prison. A man named Emmanuel Redding, who didn't kill anybody, shot somebody in the leg. Man survived, and he still had to serve all his time locked up. 46 years since 1977. Came home. Now he's on home confinement. Probation is not an alternative for confinement. It is jail still. This man's in jail at home for the rest of his life, and still in Delaware, where people who have felonies can vote. People on probation can't vote. So this man, for his whole life now, he not going to be able to vote. And he's been paying attention to politics. As lieutenant governor, that was the one that I called to make sure that he could get out. She's probably going to run for governor 2024. And he's not going to be able to vote in that election. This man, that he owes her his freedom now, but it's not even freedom because it's home confinement still. So there's a lot of fights. There's a lot of work to do. There's a lot of work to do at the state houses and at the city halls and everywhere where we can advocate. At the courthouses, we should go and observe. We should do everything that we can. And it will be tiring. It will make you angry, but don't lose your voice and continue to just pay attention and be a part of things like this. I thank the Sensing Project and everybody else that came, that put this together, the ACLUs and all the different groups. Where are you from? Louisiana, Mississippi? And you were in Angola, right? All right, but
Putting our babies in Angola, which is ridiculous. So thank you all. We are at time. I hope you guys were okay with this format. I'm just not a real formal person, and so I don't like to do formal things. So I hope that this was okay for you. Thank you for indulging me and us having this family conversation, because I consider us family, and hold us accountable to make sure we put that together, to give you those talking points in case you are faced with these ridiculous questions. But thank you so much. Thank you for the work that you do back home. We know that everybody's liberation is tied up into the liberation of another, and we cannot be free until everybody is free. So free them all.
I got one more thing. If folks are interested and are not already engaged with the National Voting in Prison Coalition, we have a communications working group that meets and creates docs like these. We know that it's a narrative battle at this moment. And so if you're interested in joining those meetings, talk to me whenever while we're here, and I'll get you on the invite list. Sarah also is on that committee as well. So if you're interested in that, share your ideas at those meetings. We can create better narrative documents for us as a collective.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to people on Zoom as well.
Thank you, Zoom.